At first, Kaneda was an adult office worker who hated women, but because he was so busy, Kaneda became extremely exhausted until he was hit by a car, causing him to die. In his critical moment, Kaneda prayed that if he was reborn, he wanted to enter the game world and live peacefully. Until Kaneda's last request came true, he reincarnated and became a supporting character in that game. However, Kaneda found problems because his character was hated by many female servants since he liked to do lewd things. Now Kaneda wants to change his bad reputation by firing almost all the female servants. Then he held a contest to find a personal bodyguard, and at that moment he met Basil and Olive, after that Crescent. Kaneda also trained in magic and entered the ranks of Royal Academy students. Being born as the child of a rich merchant made Kaneda live comfortably, but he still had an arrogant feeling until finally he met Van. Van is a noble child who has bad luck. That is where the beginning of the story of the arrogant Kaneda started. Since meeting Van, Kaneda became worried if the people around him admired Van, especially since Kaneda is indeed an arrogant person. Will Van's presence become a disaster for Kaneda, or the opposite? Watch the story of Kaneda, the arrogant one who wants to be seen as good. The atmosphere visible this time is a tall building towering into the sky. Of course, all of that only exists in urban areas and large offices are in those buildings. Now the figure of a man could only surrender and lament his fate. Even his gaze looked empty. He could only look up at the blue sky along with the birds dancing above it, as if the current situation was mocking the man. A clear sigh was visible on the man's face. He muttered that he hated women because besides being troublesome, many women around him could only talk about him behind his back. Even like now, when the man was sad, there were women talking about the man's very bad nature. Even they themselves did not know the reason behind everything the man did. Kaneda. That was the name of the male figure who at this moment was determined not to have any relationship with women because he already hated the women around him. It was not that Kaneda did not want to join a party talked about by the girls. He only felt tired of relationships that did not make him feel benefited, but it seemed the girls talking about Kaneda did not know about that. Kaneda was already fed up. He could no longer stand the many talks from the girls who always mocked him. Even at this moment Kaneda heard how those girls said that at Kaneda's age, who had already entered 30 years old, Kaneda still did not have a partner because of his too cold attitude. Moreover, according to the girls, Kaneda's face was also not very attractive. If Kaneda continued to maintain his cold attitude, maybe according to the girls Kaneda would never get married, let alone have a girlfriend. Kaneda could only listen. He even already knew that he was not good and not very popular. Therefore he only restrained himself, sitting alone on the bench while enjoying the passing wind. He had been sitting alone long enough under the shade of the trees. Because the time already showed the arrival of night, Kaneda decided to go home. Because he had no friends, Kaneda could only walk alone while playing with his phone, so it would not feel too quiet. Many messages came in that Kaneda saw, but he only smiled even though it hurt because the people in his office always mocked Kaneda. Even though he knew the message did not include his name, his feeling told him it was a message for him. Feeling fed up with the office group, he chose to open another chat that promoted one game to Kaneda, where the game contained many female players. However, Kaneda tried to avoid it because he did not want to play the game since he was already fed up with women. It was not without reason why Kaneda hated women, because every time the man got involved with women, even if only a little, Kaneda always ended up in a bad situation. That was why he chose to stay away from women, and until the age of 30 he did not have a partner. Kaneda also often felt annoyed when he saw banners of couples. Even on the way he once lost focus and thought the red light for pedestrians was the time to cross, but because he was not focused it caused him to have an accident. Kaneda did not realize there was a car moving so fast. Kaneda only stood still watching the movement of the car that would hit his body. There was no time for Kaneda to dodge because the speed of the car exceeded average, and in the end Kaneda was hit. Kaneda's body bounced, and his vision suddenly darkened. Then he realized that at this moment, he was already lying on the asphalt. Before Kaneda lost consciousness, he saw the figure of the woman who hit him. Fresh blood flowed from Kaneda's head until finally Kaneda could not be saved. That was the end of Kaneda's life story in the past. Before Kaneda's life ended, he had a hope. If there really was a next life, he wanted to live like in the game world that he often played, until a screen like a broken DVD dragged Kaneda into it without Kaneda realizing. Kaneda thought he was already dead. However, it seemed his destiny was far better than he thought. Slowly, Kaneda opened his eyes. He made sure whether at this moment he was in the hospital, but his guess was wrong. Kaneda was not in the hospital. He once thought that if he was given the chance to live, he would sue the person who hit him. But this time Kaneda felt something strange, especially since he was not in the hospital, but in a place he did not recognize at all. There was also a girl staring at him, making Kaneda widen his eyes. Clearly he did not believe the sight he saw at all. The girl's gaze, the atmosphere that was so awkward, and also Kaneda's head that suddenly felt dizzy made him feel unwell. However, he was also made confused because suddenly a shadow appeared in his mind where Kaneda saw the figure of a small boy trying to molest his servant. The boy was slapped and caused him to fall from a fairly high staircase. In Kaneda's memory, the fairly high staircase made the child bounce and lose consciousness. There was something wrong. Kaneda realized it, where his thoughts about his past were different. But when the servant realized that her master looked confused, she tried to explain so that Kaneda did not need to think too much because the impact on his head was quite strong. Remembering there was a glimpse of memory, Kaneda questioned the figure of the servant who almost made him lose his life. The female servant accompanying Kaneda explained that the female servant who almost killed him had already been handed over to the police. However, it was clearly visible in Kaneda's eyes how the woman who was currently with him looked gloomy when discussing the figure of the servant who almost made Kaneda almost die. The bandage wrapped around Kaneda's had already explained how Kaneda was not okay at all. Kaneda tried to digest everything he had gone through, and he did not expect that he had been born and reincarnated into another world. A very heavy sigh and a little confusion made Kaneda only able to lie down. Especially the pain that spread in his head could not be taken lightly. When Kaneda chose to sleep, suddenly he heard the voice of a girl calling him. Of course, hearing that voice made Kaneda turn his face. He stared at the girl with full of question marks. Mary, briefly a memory about the little girl who greeted Kaneda, flashed in the boy's mind. He knew the little girl was his stepsister and how the sister was tortured. Kaneda also knew all of that. Therefore Kaneda asked how Mary could escape from the guards. Mary loved Kaneda so much that even to make sure Kaneda was okay, she had to risk herself. When the sound of footsteps that would enter Kaneda's room was heard, Kaneda asked his sister to quickly hide so she would not be caught and judged. Sure enough, the figure of a big old man with a beard entered, greeting Kaneda with his very loud voice. The figure of the man was Kaneda's father, and in this game world Kaneda had changed his name to Hawk. His father was very worried about Kaneda. Even to cheer Kaneda up, he persuaded the child by promising to buy him cake, and Kaneda's inappropriate treatment of his servant was also not too questioned. The departure of the father from Kaneda's room made Mary able to come out of her hiding place. Mary did not expect that Kaneda would protect her, different from the Kaneda she used to know. Kaneda had not changed, he only realized that he had to fix his bad traits. That was what he said to his sister. The reason why Kaneda was kind to his sister was because he knew that in the past Mary was treated unfairly, but he emphasized to Mary that even though he was kind, Mary could not take advantage of him, and Mary understood that. Then Kaneda's conversation became random, making Mary shocked, especially hearing that Kaneda would carry out a massive cleanup in his house. The atmosphere was silent and quiet. There were no whispers from people that Kaneda often heard. He felt his life this time was already calm, and as usual, his principle was that he would not get involved with anything called women. Kaneda's newest eyes opened wide. He stared at the sky of his house with a gaze that was so innocent and full of determination. Kaneda tried to get up from his bed. The boy rubbed his heavy-feeling nape. He remembered how he had been hit by an unknown figure. Kaneda felt his whole body hurt because of the effect of the impact from the collision. Kaneda looked toward the bedroom window, gazing at the scenery outside the house. This time an unusual sight was seen by Kaneda. He realized that he had now been thrown into another world. Kaneda reincarnated and entered a world he did not recognize at all. The scenery outside the window looked so foreign. There were hot air balloons and flying dragons circling a volcano, just like fairy tales often seen by small children. Kaneda, who used to live in the city, now felt like he was in a village with dense settlements. That was all Kaneda realized for now. Not only that, Kaneda also looked around his house, where the house was so big like a palace. Gordo Trading Company. That was what Kaneda saw at this moment. Gordo Trading Company was owned by Kaneda's family at this time. However, what Kaneda regretted was that the company owned by his family was involved in sales that treated crime and unlimited debt credit, and all of that turned out to be very hated by people. His company was often nicknamed as a very evil trading company. Little Kaneda walked through his house. Many servants served Kaneda and bowed to him. An atmosphere like that had never been obtained by Kaneda during his life, so he slightly enjoyed the treatment as someone respected. According to Kaneda, most of the servants in his house were his father's mistresses, and the rest were hired only to be sexually harassed by former members of his family's household. Such treatment was very cruel. This time Kaneda walked with piled-up thoughts where he no longer wanted to be pushed from the stairs. Even though he knew the accident was because of his own actions, he tried to avoid all bad possibilities that would happen to him. Because something had happened, Kaneda decided to select the servants who would serve him. He would keep the head servant named Laurier, and for the other servants he would carry out layoffs quickly. Of course, that was only to get rid of the servants he considered lazy. In accordance with Kaneda's plan this time, he whined like a child, meeting his father and asking to be held like a spoiled child to his father. In his father's lap, Kaneda cried and complained to his father that he did not want to see servants anymore, and he really wanted all the servants in his luxurious house to be fired. Of course, when hearing that, Kaneda's father shouted loudly. The father could only follow all his son's requests and said to all the servants who served him that they were fired. Kaneda's father's voice was so thunderous, especially when stating that the servants were fired. It made all the female servants in the house feel strange and panicked. All those servants whispered because they did not believe they would be free from the bad treatment of the father and son in front of them. But of course they were also confused about how they could earn a living later. It was not without reason that the father agreed to his son's words to fire all the servants in his house. The father knew that his son's worry was his top priority, where Kaneda had almost lost his life because of the servants' actions. Many things were discussed by the father and son regarding the servants behind the dismissal. They both planned to recruit personal bodyguards, but of course the father knew that firing servants and recruiting personal bodyguards might not make Kaneda feel safe. Therefore, Kaneda chose to socialize with the head servant regarding the recruitment of his personal bodyguard later. Kaneda never imagined that every word he said was obeyed by his father. However, what he realized at this moment was that his father really loved him, which was why there was a small gap that could be used by Kaneda regarding his father. After the massive firing of the servants and the discussion about recruiting personal bodyguards, it was time for the moment Kaneda had been waiting for. A few days later he held a contest, and all the tough men around his village had gathered to meet Kaneda. Kaneda clearly saw how a sea of people had gathered in the courtyard of his house. Kaneda also explained the purpose and goal of recruiting personal bodyguards, and at this moment he would select anyone who had the right to become his personal bodyguard and could be trusted by him. Kaneda's loud words made everyone whisper, and there was one that caught attention because at this moment he saw the figure of a big man with a head like an animal. The man looked calm. He did not look nervous at all. Kaneda's index finger began to point at people he thought were capable of becoming his personal bodyguards. Everyone had been pointed at personally by Kaneda until no one could protest the choice Kaneda decided. Those selected people of course had quite sturdy bodies, but there were also some of them who were not selected and felt betrayed and tried to rebel against Kaneda. Kaneda really hated people who were not obedient to him. Therefore he ordered Laurier to resolve the problem, and as usual the woman obeyed every word of the little boy in front of her. The people who were not chosen by Kaneda were expelled by the child, because only those selected would carry out the next selection process. That was why many of those present felt angry at the decision made by Kaneda. A very frightening aura was visible. Laurier showed how she handled the situation. Kaneda's order became one of Laurier's priorities. Therefore she released all her strength with an emotional and frightening gaze. She said that if the people who were not selected did not immediately leave the environment of the house where she was judging, then she would use force to expel them all. Of course, that frightening aura made everyone who saw it run in a hurry. Some even fell. Seeing how one of the guards he pointed at fell, Kaneda decided to dismiss him. Of course he acted a little gently but firmly. It was time for Kaneda to decide who would become candidates as his personal bodyguards. Many had already withdrawn, and many were also made to withdraw by the threat thrown by Laurier. Now only candidates who according to Kaneda would become superior seeds to become his personal bodyguards remained. The first Basil. The man had characteristics of a bald head, and his gaze was very sharp, and his body was very sturdy, showing how he was very worthy to become a personal bodyguard. The second candidate was Olive, a man who had an upright body and also a cold personality, but with a head like an animal. The man was also quite convincing to become Kanita's personal bodyguard. The third candidate was a little different because she was a woman hibiscus. However, if you looked at it, the candidate bodyguard also had a quite cold personality and strong self-confidence. Kanita had chosen 3 best people according to him. One reason Kanita chose Basil was because he had a history of working in a horse stable, and that was why Kanita felt he could trust Basil to do heavy lifting. Then for Olive he chose him because Kanita felt Olive would become a good escort, especially since he was a former mercenary. However, there was a problem with Hibiscus because she was a woman whom Kanita actually wanted to avoid. But Kanita had to think more clearly because Hibiscus had quite adequate equipment to become a personal bodyguard for Kanita. It had been decided by Kanita. Therefore he chose 3 people out of the many sea of people who came to his house to become personal bodyguards. To proceed to the next stage, Kanita invited those candidate bodyguards to enter his house. Of course, the magnificent house made the candidate bodyguards feel amazed. After touring the house quite far, Kanita invited the candidate bodyguards to eat together. Of course he had another strategy because Kanita would always follow luxurious dining events, especially since he was the heir to the Gordo company. Because of that reason, Kanita invited those candidate bodyguards to join the meal and learn manners as servants who would travel with him. Luxurious food, with various kinds of dishes of course, made appetite increase. But it seemed the candidate bodyguards looked relaxed, as if they already understood the situation. However, it did not last long because the 3 candidate bodyguards changed their attitude a few seconds later. And at the dining table, Olive and Hibiscus were the calmest, different from Basil who ate a little greedily. After eating together, of course Kanita did not forget the next test. Therefore he ordered the candidate bodyguards to follow him to another room where the test would be conducted. Everyone obeyed. None of them contradicted Kanita's words, and they even stood neatly in front of Kanita as if ready to receive the next order. As expected this time, Basil and Olive successfully passed and were accepted as Kanita's bodyguards according to the final decision, but not with Hibiscus. Kanita did not accept her as his personal bodyguard. Of course that made Hibiscus feel injustice in the decision. Hibiscus filed her protest to Kanita loudly. Kanita's reason for not accepting Hibiscus was not because she was someone who could not be trusted, but there was one thing that made Kanita feel that Hibiscus was not suitable to become his bodyguard. Besides the fact that she was a woman, Hibiscus looked unable to hide the gaze that showed she hated rich people. That was the core of the problem that made Hibiscus eliminated. A reason that was so piercing for Hibiscus, but she also had no other choice. Therefore Hibiscus knelt and begged Kanita to employ her, especially since she needed a lot of money. After quite mature consideration, where Kanita knew Hibiscus's complicated life background, he decided to just accept her because he wanted to avoid bad things happening to him in the future. When Kanita decided to accept Hibiscus, of course the woman felt disbelief. She only stared blankly at Kanita. Then a few seconds later she tried to confirm Kanita's words. "Thank you." That was the word from Hibiscus that was heard in Kanita's ears. Then the next utterance made Kanita blush shyly, where Hibiscus misunderstood Kanita's words. Hibiscus thought Kanita would make her a mistress. That was why she felt embarrassed at this moment, especially since Hibiscus had a very close distance with him. After the selection event for the bodyguards, now Kanita gave one of his trusts as a bodyguard to Mary. The figure of Hibiscus was entrusted to become the bodyguard of his little sister. Kanita looked so gallant when he met his sister and said that Hibiscus would guard Mary starting from that moment. Mary of course stuttered. She did not know what to say. She even made sure whether her brother's words were true. Kanita felt sorry for his sister. He knew how his little sister was intimidated by their father. How Mary was ostracized in her house environment also became the reason for Kanita to give one servant to Mary, so that Mary could be happy and protected. Mary became shy. She did not expect that her older brother at this moment was already so attentive to her, far different from before who always intimidated her. From shyness to accept the bodyguard given by her brother Kanita, because she knew someone like her might not deserve to get guarding. However, Kanita denied it because he did not want his family's reputation to be damaged by not giving one bodyguard to Mary. Seeing how determined the figure of Kaneda was to give her a bodyguard, of course Mary felt happy. The little child even smiled at Kaneda, looking so sincere and graceful. She also, of course, did not forget to express her gratitude because of the affection given indirectly by her brother. After handing over one of his bodyguards, now Kaneda left his sister's room. It was visible how Kaneda made a small smile on his face. Kaneda was even accompanied by Basil and also Olive. The corridor of the house became a witness to how Kaneda had changed into a better figure for his sister. The happiness shown by Kaneda from his facial expression made one of his servants named Basil ask whether there was something good accompanying Kaneda, because seeing Kaneda so happy and relieved. Yeah, how could Kaneda not be happy because he felt his life was much calmer? The number of female servants was reduced, and he also provided one female servant for his little sibling. According to Kaneda, for someone like him who did not feel comfortable with many women around him, that was one of the greatest achievements while he was in the foreign world where he lived now. Firing the female servants made his days obtain peace, but Kaneda realized that all of that was only temporary when he heard a foreign voice entering and greeting him. A voice that was exactly like a woman's voice. And sure enough, what Kaneda heard was not wrong. There was a foreign woman who entered his house, and the woman was named Mint. Kaneda's instinct said that Mint was a new enemy he had to face. It was not without reason that Kaneda thought like that, because Mint was a woman who might have been sent by his father. Kaneda had already activated his alert mode toward the woman who had just appeared in front of him. It seemed Kaneda only enjoyed his peace for a moment because the real disturber had already appeared. His surprise because of Mint's presence certainly made him feel discomfort. Kaneda thought very hard about how the figure of Mint could enter his house because he had never invited a woman at all. Sure enough, Kaneda remembered one thing where he whined to his father to be given a tutor to train him in magic, but this was not what Kaneda asked for. His father was too naive and only thought about women, whereas Kaneda wanted the opposite. He wanted a male tutor. But what could be done? His father's thinking was far different, and therefore his thoughts and his father's always contradicted each other and could not be guessed. There was no other hope, so Kaneda accepted Mint reluctantly. This time he relaxed while staring at his prospective teacher, and of course he was also accompanied by Basil and Olive. Kaneda accepted Mint not without reason, because he knew that actually only Mint was the only magician who could use dark magic that Kaneda wanted to learn. As long as it was not a flirtatious woman, of course Kaneda did not mind her presence. He was only impatient to learn magic. Even his desire to learn magic was clearly readable. Especially at this moment, Kaneda was full of determination. As if not accepting intimidation, Mint looked relaxed, facing the little boy in front of her. She was not tense at all and acted like a teacher who would teach her student. Feeling there was something strange, Mint tried to turn her head right and left, looking at the situation inside the house. However, Mint felt strange because there was only the figure of Kaneda and his two bodyguards, whereas Kaneda's parents were not seen by Mint. That was why she asked Kaneda where the figure of Kaneda's parents was, of course only to make sure that she was indeed sent by Kaneda's parents. To neutralize his nervousness because of the question about Kaneda's parents, he tried to dodge, and his authority began to appear again where he said that he did not have a mother in his house, and also of course his father had his own busyness. So for learning guidance matters, all of that was entrusted to Kaneda. Of course Kaneda's statement was not strange. Therefore Mint tried to give appreciation to Kaneda because from childhood he had been independent. Mint was also given a work contract letter by Kaneda, and Mint quickly signed the document because her reason for coming to Kaneda's house was to become a mentor for the boy in front of her. Mint wanted to act politely toward Kaneda because anyway Kaneda was her master. However, it seemed Kaneda was not crazy about respect, so he decided that his prospective teacher would treat him normally without any honorary titles accompanying it. After the contract signing was finished, it was time for Mint to become the magic teacher who would accompany Kaneda. Mint decided to go out of Kaneda's house and give a little teaching to her little student. Outside the house, of course the sound of wind was heard so gently. The atmosphere outside the house was of course so peaceful. Kaneda was also accompanied by Basil and Olive, who never missed guarding Kaneda. Mint explained how her work method was to obtain magic knowledge. This time, because Mint felt there was cool air, she explained some contents of substances from the air called elements. Therefore magicians took energy from the elements in the air and changed them into abilities to create magic through the body and create a miracle. Kaneda saw Mint's figure like a real teacher, especially since she explained in detail how the process of creating the magic knowledge that he would learn. Mint was really serious in giving the first lesson to Kaneda, even though it was still in the form of theory. Mint's very detailed statement made Kaneda understand more. He understood how the elements from the air were nothing more than fuel for visible magic, and it would change automatically once it entered the body. That was what Kaneda learned for the first time. The elements from the air could be changed using spells, and that was what was tried to be practiced so that Kaneda could see it clearly. A spell was recited. This time Mint played with her hands while closing her eyes, reading some spells, and suddenly a change occurred where Kaneda was suddenly lifted into the air above the earth. The sudden movement made Kaneda amazed. He did not believe that the magic shown by Mint was so amazing. Explanation after explanation could be understood by Kaneda. He was the type of quick-witted child. Seeing how enthusiastic Kaneda was made Mint feel the same. She was so proud of her prospective student. As usual, a teacher would give some instructions to her student and also a textbook. Therefore now she gave her hereditary book containing lessons about magic knowledge, and it was time where Mint gave the book to Kaneda so it could be studied by the boy. Of course Kaneda would not refuse a gift from his teacher, especially since it was about the lesson he had dreamed of so much. Kaneda really wanted to become a magic expert. Therefore he would be really serious in studying every core and detail of the contents of the book given by Mint. There were some oddities from the atmosphere around Kaneda. The teacher who initially looked friendly now showed some seriousness. Even her gaze was so intense toward Kaneda. Mint warned Kaneda not to study magic knowledge or spells in the book independently because it would have a bad impact, especially if not accompanied by an adult. Therefore Mint warned Kaneda not to do anything that would make him feel disadvantaged. Kaneda clearly heard every emphasis thrown by his teacher. Therefore Kaneda only gave a short response that he would promise not to do anything that could harm himself or others. Mint's statement warning Kaneda not to practice magic alone was of course also heard by Olive. Therefore the man told Kaneda that if later Kaneda wanted to learn magic independently, he could anticipate bad events where Olive would stop Kaneda, so he would not lose control. Hearing how Olive spoke to him made Kaneda sigh. He even realized that if later Olive really stopped him from doing magic carelessly, maybe Kaneda could not do anything, considering how the muscles of Olive's body were so prominent. The decision was already firm. Mint agreed and allowed Olive to become Kaneda's guide. After that they went to another place where they would do training, and at this moment Kaneda rode his horse accompanied by his 2 bodyguards. There were some conversations to break the silence where Olive and Basil asked Kaneda to exercise often so his body would be strong, but it seemed Kaneda was reluctant. Olive and Basil also warned Kaneda not to act recklessly, or maybe they would betray Kaneda someday, because many things would happen later. But it seemed Kaneda did not mind that because for now he would focus on learning his magic knowledge. The friendly conversation had ended, and something tense happened where Laurier gave a warning to Kaneda that he had a guest named Sunny. Just one word he heard. The name was not foreign, and that was why Kaneda felt his life was threatened again. He could not even hide his annoyed expression in front of his bodyguards and servants. Sunny, the name and the person were so intimidating. Even the displeased facial expression from Kaneda could be seen by his bodyguards until they wondered who the figure named Sunny was. Kaneda, without thinking long, gave a little clue to his bodyguards that the figure of the girl was Kaneda's fiancée, whom Kaneda himself did not want because in accordance with Kaneda's principle, he would not get involved with any woman, and he really hated women who liked to have sweet mouths and rotten hearts. Meanwhile, on the other side in a room, Sunny was waiting for Kaneda's arrival. Sunny, that girl, was waiting for Kaneda with full worry. Not because she liked Kaneda, but because she was afraid of her fiancé. Sunny was only forced to be engaged to Kaneda because Kaneda's father was too powerful in the area. So Sunny had no other choice even though the stake was Sunny's own mental state. This time Sunny waited for Kaneda in silence. She looked out the window with a completely empty gaze and also let out a tired sigh. Sunny remembered how she had been treated badly by Kaneda. Even often when Sunny visited to meet Kaneda, the man always avoided her and not infrequently teased and kicked Sunny until she fell flat. When remembering Kaneda's bad treatment, it made Sunny feel unappreciated as Kaneda's fiancé. The thing Sunny remembered most was how Kaneda said that he did not want to marry a woman like Sunny even though it would kill him. Kaneda accepted Sunny as a partner because it was his father's order. The insults and curses that came one after another saying that Sunny was ugly were already normal for her. But Kanita's thought that he would bring many beautiful women into his house made Sunny's heart even more hurt. She could not even control herself from hiding her anger. On the other side, Kanita hurried to meet Sunny. He saw how the girl was staring blankly out the window while waiting for his arrival. Kanita stepped slowly but surely. He secretly met Sunny because if it was considered that Kanita had not met his fiancée for a long time. Kanita began to greet Sunny with Rama, but not with his facial expression that was still cold toward women. Kanita's words were quite formal, where he asked what Kanita could help Sunny with. Then the woman was shocked. She did not believe what she heard. How could the figure of Kanita speak so formally and not humiliate her like some time ago where Sunny's bad memories began to form? Because she did not believe in Kanita's change, Sunny tried to make sure that Kanita was really the same person and was her cruel fiancé. But upon getting that question, it seemed Kanita knew very well how Sunny did not believe in his existence, especially the very drastic change from Kanita himself. Kanita dodged that he was the same person and not a substitute actor like what Sunny thought. There was a little awkward feeling spreading in Kanita because Sunny stared at him so intensely. For the umpteenth time, Kanita explained that he was the real Kanita. It was really troublesome to explain to many people about his change that was so significant. Therefore, for the umpteenth time, Kanita also said that he had only realized that his attitude in the past was not good. That was why he tried something new and changed his way of looking and thinking pattern, so that later he could become a better person. The flashback of how Kanita could meet Sunny was because she was the daughter of a baron who gave a large amount of money as a loan to the baron family. And because of that, as a guarantee, Kanita's father asked the baron to make Kanita his son-in-law. That was the first meeting between Kanita and Sunny. As usual, Kanita still had such a high principle toward a woman. Even not infrequently, this time Kanita tried to keep speaking arrogantly in front of Sunny. Sometimes Kanita also spoke in a point that Sunny did not like him because in reality Kanita was still alive. No, Sunny's arrival this time was truly sincere. She even made potpourri from flowers she planted herself for Kanita's recovery. And when she expressed her sincerity, it was very clear how Sunny blushed shyly. Even her cheeks turned red because she could not hide her awkward feeling toward Kanita. Sunny's hands trembled because she was afraid that Kanita would not accept the gift she had worked hard to make. How happy Sunny was this time because her gift was accepted by Kanita with open arms, and that made her feel a special vibration in Sunny's heart. After giving the gift to Kanita, of course Sunny returned to her house. Behind the window, Kanita stared at the departure of his fiancée. The horses brought by Sunny's guards galloped away from Kanita's house yard. Kanita also began to ponder. Even in his previous life, he had never thought of getting married. But when he woke up in another world, Kanita had to face the reality that he already had a fiancée. That was the reason why Kanita's gaze was directed at Sunny's departure. This time Kanita began to sit in his lounge. He only thought about canceling his engagement with Sunny, even though he knew that it was very contrary to his father's thinking, but he would still try. According to Kanita, doing a little resistance was not a wrong thing. Another cunning thought began to occur to Kanita. He even really wanted to go to the slave market. Whatever the purpose, it was clear he only wanted to go there. But of course Basil and Olive did not agree because the slave market was not a place to play around, especially since it involved Kanita's safety. Therefore they tried to warn Kanita not to think about going there. Olive also felt a little confused because he felt there was something strange about how Kanita suddenly wanted to go to the market. If allowed to guess, he was afraid that the company managed by Kanita's father was also involved in slave trading. There was a reason why Kanita wanted to go to the slave market. Namely, he wanted the nobles to feel disgusted because he socialized in that place, and because of his father too, that became the reason for Kanita to do something reckless. Olive was of course shocked to hear Kanita's statement, but he quickly understood, unlike Basil. That was why Kanita asked Basil not to join if he did not want to. As in the agreement, on this trip Kanita was only supervised by Olive while Basil stayed behind. Kanita and Olive walked toward the slave market. Along the way there was no doubt at all. Many people looked dressed so enemy-like and unworthy. The slave market they saw was also very common and not for visiting. The dense settlement of the slave market was of course filled with many slaves who would be sold to nobles to become servants. The market air that grew stinging entered the nose, and of course they had arrived at the intended place, namely the slave market. because there he saw how the prospective slaves were locked in iron bars. Olive was so worried about his master. Therefore, he tried to give a warning to Kaneda so they would go home, but Kaneda remained a person with a firm stance. He still wanted to continue his journey and complete the mission. Olive was not afraid at all if he would get hurt, but he did not want Kaneda to do something reckless and trouble him. That was the reason why Olive always gave warnings to the little boy who was his master. Olive, the man with an animal-like head, saw how firm Kaneda's stance was. Even at this moment, Kaneda tried to break through the crowd by watching how the slave purchase transactions took place. Seeing Kaneda's small body that was having difficulty made Olive take the initiative to carry Kaneda, and because of Olive's spontaneous movement, Kaneda was of course a little shocked. But for a moment he understood the reason Olive carried him. And because of Olive, Kaneda became free to see the thing that made him curious. Now Kaneda understood how the slave purchase transaction took place. Kaneda's quite sharp eyes saw a figure that interested him, namely a woman with cat ears who was inside the iron bars. According to what Kaneda knew, the woman was a prospective slave. The slave sales broker approached Kaneda and asked Kaneda whether he was interested in buying a slave. Of course, Kaneda was a little interested in doing the transaction. For quite a long time, Kaneda looked at the slaves he would make as his bodyguards. At first his eyes were fixed on the cat woman figure, but he cancelled his intention so as not to get involved with women again. Therefore he chose a big growing man with an animal head like a tiger. It was not without reason because he chose the tiger man because according to him the man was more reliable. Even though occasionally the broker who sold the slaves tried to negotiate with Kaneda to buy both, Kaneda remained with his one choice, namely the tiger man. Nervousness enveloped Olive's heart. He still tried to warn Kaneda to ask for his father's approval, but for the umpteenth time Olive could only obey what Kaneda said because the boy he was currently carrying never missed in the calculations he had guessed. The tiger man had been bought by Kaneda according to what he negotiated. When the tiger man came out, it was very clear how his stocky body with big muscles and height twice as big as Olive made them stunned for a moment. Then Kaneda changed his gaze to a very cold and piercing one where he signaled that he was the master of the tiger man. The atmosphere grew tense. Not a single one gave in to his sharp gaze, whether it was the tiger man or Kaneda. Kaneda began to ask arrogantly to the slave he had just bought. What was the slave's name, and also explained the slave's future duties. Crescent. That was the name of the slave, the tiger man who would become Kaneda's number 3 bodyguard. But it seemed Crescent did not agree with that, and instead cursed Kaneda and promised to kill Kaneda one day. His voice that was so thunderous with a little tiger roar explained the magnitude of the hatred thrown by Crescent at him. Now it was time for Kaneda to bring Crescent home, and he also tried to speak casually with his new bodyguard and asked Crescent to take a bath. But Crescent still tried to be arrogant and did not want to end peacefully with Kaneda. On the other side, the reason Kaneda did not choose the cat woman was because Kaneda saw the woman as a female hero disguising as a slave, and that must be avoided by him so that his life would be peaceful without any disturbance. He did not want to ruin his plans. This is the beginning story of why Basil chose to become Kaneda's bodyguard. Basil needed money for his survival, and Basil did not want to end tragically. Basil went to the horse stable to check his horse whether it was in prime condition to be used, and after that he went to meet his old friend to ask for work. But it seemed his friend was not friendly to Basil because when Basil asked for work to become a high-rank monster hunter with decent pay, it seemed Basil could not get all of that because there was no request at all for Basil. Of course Basil felt tired. He was so emotional because he did not get what he wanted. Then how did Basil dispel his loneliness? Even he also needed more money, so he tried to look for side jobs. The atmosphere grew hotter. Basil could not think about what would happen to him if he was no longer a monster hunter. Just imagining that made Basil feel dizzy. Seeing how Basil was already desperate made the monster hunting job give him a sheet of announcement where there was a young man from the Gordo Trading Company looking for bodyguards, and he gave a little advice to Basil so that the man would take the opportunity. At first Basil did not want to do the job as a noble's bodyguard because he really hated it. He even did not want to be ordered around. But when he realized one thing and saw how there was a group of people who became homeless, he tried to crumple the announcement paper and said that he did not want to end up as a beggar until his determination became firm. He unconsciously brought out his survival instinct rather than his own ego. Basil's past was so bad. Therefore now he realized that what he got after becoming Kanita's bodyguard made him feel guilty. He should not have hated that noble child, but he only thought logically because he heard bad rumors about Kanita. But after he had become the child's bodyguard, he felt Kanita was quite good, especially since Kanita gave him a decent life and delicious food. Moreover, Basil could take care of the horses that he once really liked. Because of that, he would apologize to Kanita after Kanita returned from his trip with Olive. From afar, Basil stared at the arrival of Kanita along with Olive. But the thing that made his mind wonder was the tall, big figure next to Olive. Because Basil was a person with high curiosity. Of course, he asked whether Kanita had just gotten the muscular man he wanted again. Because Basil did not know that when a noble went to the slave market, of course what was sought was female slaves who could be ordered to satisfy lust. But it seemed his thinking was wrong because what he saw was the opposite. Kanita's way of thinking was really different from other noble children. Kanita knew what was in Basil's mind. Therefore, he tried to straighten out what happened because Kanita did not want to damage his own image. That was why Kanita explained that he went to the slave market not to look for female slaves who would be treated as lust satisfiers, but he looked for an ordinary bodyguard. That was the real reason why Kanita decided to buy the biggest and strongest one he could find in the slave market. Hearing the many praises thrown by Kanita made Crescent big-headed. Moreover, at this moment the man laughed and said that Kanita had good eyesight. Of course, Kanita did not feel intimidated at all. Wasn't Kanita's thinking not like an 8-year-old child? And that was what Basil realized because according to him it was still unthinkable for Kanita, especially just to think about complicated things. Realizing that Basil doubted Kanita's thinking pattern, he tried to give understanding to Basil and the others that Kanita was only a child who grew up like what Basil saw. Of course, Kanita actually knew his thinking pattern was far more mature than an 8-year-old child. Therefore, he tried to hide his original identity. The many smells of fresh meat made Crescent drool. The man felt hungry and, of course, because there was sensitivity. Kanita told Crescent that he would prepare food for his new bodyguard. It seemed Crescent was still not comfortable with Kanita and had not considered Kanita as his master. Crescent even said that Kanita was very stingy because he did not give the horses he saw to be eaten. On the other side, Basil realized the threat that Crescent showed. He was angry and threatened Crescent not to mess with the horses he had taken care of. The small quarrel was clearly not a good sign, but Kanita could still handle it. After a fairly long conversation outside the house, now it was time for Kanita to take his new bodyguard to look around Kanita's house, especially since he was very uncomfortable with Crescent's smell. According to Kanita, the man's smell was so stinging, especially since he really liked cleanliness. Kanita asked Olive to take Crescent to the bathroom just to clean himself. It was just that Crescent could not understand why Kanita allowed him to bathe in the boy's house when he was a slave. Of course, Kanita did not mind that because he only liked cleanliness, and he wanted the people around him to be clean and seen as good. That was the reason why Kanita allowed his bodyguards to use all facilities in Kanita's house. In the conversation between Crescent and Kanita, Olive also remembered the flashback of how he decided to become Kanita's bodyguard, where he was given a sheet by the job-providing broker. Olive did not think of anything. He even only thought about how to survive, and even the bad words about Kanita were ignored by Olive. Olive's past was quite dark, where he used to be a very strong former soldier. But he had a little deficiency, namely unfriendliness to people, or more precisely being proud and arrogant. There were many talks about Olive, but because he was the type of person who was indifferent, he did not respond to any issues about himself. Olive's daydream stopped when he thought how Kanita could judge him when he himself was a person who was not obsessed with anything. So refreshing. Even it felt like Kanita wanted to sleep in the bathtub. The bubbling water indicated that the pool he currently occupied was a hot water pool. Kanita, Olive, and Crescent were busy cleaning themselves and occasionally chatting, especially since Crescent discussed his hometown, which made Kanita even more curious about Crescent's figure. Kanita also dreamed of going on vacation to Crescent's hometown one day because, as Crescent told, in his village there was a very big hot water pool that Crescent often visited. Again and again, Olive was like an advisor for Kanita. When he heard the tone of wanting to go to the hometown, he tried to forbid it because, as far as Olive knew, if Kanita went there with Crescent, who was a slave, especially from the east, maybe they would kill Kanita. Of course, that would trouble Olive later as Kanita's bodyguard. All of Olive's words were indeed true. Therefore, Kaneda decided that Crescent would stay when he wanted to go on vacation to Crescent's hometown. The thunderous voice filled the bathroom room, and of course it belonged to Crescent, where he protested to Kaneda, why only because there was someone who could enjoy hot water bathing and eat delicious food in his hometown. But the next slap began to approach Crescent, where Kaneda said that Crescent was a slave who might threaten his life. Kaneda's attitude was so casual that it made Crescent confused. Especially at this moment, the stocky man could only scratch his non-itchy head, because Kaneda's words were not wrong where Crescent was a slave for now. But because Kaneda's attitude was so casual toward him, it made him forget his identity as a slave. And that was a strange thing, because usually masters who bought a slave did not treat their slaves so casually like a friend. Yeah, wasn't Kaneda a strange person? That was Crescent's thought until it made him awkward. Olive glanced at Kaneda from the side. He felt there was a special calm after some time with Kaneda. Olive did not care if Kaneda was a strange person, because Olive felt the time he spent in the luxurious house was, according to him, a little more enjoyable. There was something that stuck in Olive's heart, but when he felt all that he knew very well, it was a calm that Olive had wanted all this time. When the self-cleaning process was finished, of course Kaneda, Olive, and also Crescent came out of their bathroom. They even drank one new concoction drink, which according to them was strange. Even Crescent felt the drink gulped by Kaneda was deadly poison because he had never seen such a striking drink color. Kaneda's friendly attitude made the newly joined Crescent feel confused, and that was understood by Olive. He tried to explain that Kaneda was indeed a very humble person. After some conversation, Basil appeared who informed that their food was ready, and that was the most exciting thing for Basil's figure, where it was time to enjoy delicious food. The food was ready. Of course, Kaneda invited his 3 bodyguards to eat together because he was not selfish to finish various foods alone. Kaneda also asked what food Crescent liked until it made Crescent uneasy because Kaneda's attitude was too casual toward him. Crescent was afraid he would forget himself regarding Kaneda's status. The morning that was so heavy according to Kaneda. Even he felt very sleepy and did not want to wake up. However, his deep sleep was forced to be disturbed by Laurier because the servant opened the window curtains until the stinging hot rays pierced into Kaneda's skin. Kaneda had no other choice. He slowly opened his eyes. Various kinds of dishes were introduced by Laurier to make her master wake up. Of course, after hearing the breakfast menu that was so tempting, it made Kaneda open his eyes, especially since he also felt his stomach was already starting to get hungry. Kaneda's very heavy eyes slowly began to open. He hated the most if he found the served food already cold. Therefore, he was determined to enjoy his breakfast menu while warm, especially if it was already cold. The food would no longer taste delicious. With a heavy heart, Kaneda began to sit. He was fully awake from his sleep while Laurier asked permission from Kaneda so she could help Kaneda tidy up, but Kaneda said that he could do it himself until Laurier excused herself to leave him. There was something strange felt by Laurier about her master. For several days, Kaneda seemed to have become another person. Laurier stared sharply at Kaneda's bedroom door, and after that slowly Laurier stepped away from Kaneda's room to return to her initial routine where she had to prepare food in the dining room for Kaneda. His family's luxurious dining room was already visible. Many various kinds of food that could be eaten by Kaneda. But his activity, of course, had to stop because he saw his father, who suddenly carried Kaneda affectionately. Even Kaneda could not refuse his father's request. His father said that Kaneda was very adorable. On the other side, Mary only watched from afar how her father loved her older brother so much. Of course, in her heart there was a hint of jealousy, but because Kaneda had changed, there was no reason for Mary to envy Kaneda. Mary tried to greet Kaneda and her father timidly. She trembled because her father might not accept Mary's presence. Mary tried to smile stiffly when greeting her father and brother. The red blush on her cheeks was also very visible, explaining how Mary hid her nervousness. Mary's greeting, of course, was heard by Kaneda. Therefore, he gently replied to his sister's greeting. But different from his father, Kaneda's father shouted angrily at Mary, and then said that he did not want to see Mary's face because it would make the food taste bad. The father also cursed Mary that Mary had no right to call him father. The words that were so painful in Mary's heart. Even she did not expect that sadistic words were expressed by her father, and this time Mary could only be ignited because she also could not fight back. Kaneda knew that Mary's expression already explained that her little sister was not okay at all, and he also felt guilty about it. Kaneda began to get angry. He showed his cold expression to his father, and warned his father that he should not speak harshly to a girl because it would damage the father's public image. Kaneda began to make his words as an excuse like advice, but his father still rebelled where he said that Mary was not his daughter and she was not part of the Hawk family. Pity enveloped Kaneda's heart, but he did not want to show it to Mary because he was afraid of being thought that Kaneda was attentive to his little sister. The father's painful words could no longer be heard by Mary. That was why he asked his father to only focus on loving him alone and stop paying attention to Mary, especially cursing her. Kaneda did not want to lose the opportunity. He also asked his father to enroll him in the Royal Academy, and of course his father obeyed all of Kaneda's requests with pleasure and hugged Kaneda full of warmth. The father really relied on Kaneda, the son he loved so much, and Kaneda's opportunity was twice as big as he thought. Kaneda took advantage of the existing situation. He tried to speak sweet words to persuade his father, and all his words bore sweet fruit. Soon he would enter the Royal Academy, the place he had dreamed of so much. After the breakfast event was finished, Kaneda moved to leave the dining room that was initially hot. He began to think about what plan he would do after entering the Royal Academy, especially since he had to always train his magic. Kaneda thought that he could not possibly only rely on the lessons given by Mint as his homeschooling teacher. Occasionally Kaneda also asked about his engagement with Sunny, whether his father really expected Kaneda to become a noble, and all of that was justified by Laurier. Therefore, because his father allowed Kaneda to join the Royal Academy, he tried his best to repay his father's service. Everything that was done must have reciprocity, so that no one felt disadvantaged. The flashback of how Laurier could be appointed by Kaneda as the head servant. Of course, Laurier did not feel proud because she heard many rumors from people that Kaneda was a very lewd little boy and even treated female servants badly. But Laurier felt a little relieved because she had become the head servant. She could approach her subordinates and Kaneda. Laurier always monitored Kaneda in any way with a cold, piercing gaze. There was a plan behind Laurier's appearance at Kaneda's house as head servant, namely a mission that she had to solve where she would kill Kaneda's father because of losing Kaneda. But it seemed her plan had failed because there was someone who fell due to the servant's actions and survived death, and his father was also safe from Laurier's murder plan. When Kaneda was in a coma where he was unconscious, Laurier had already planned to commit murder on Kaneda's father. A knife with a sharp tip stabbed Kaneda's father. It was just that for the umpteenth time her plan failed. Kaneda also began to wake up, and something unexpected happened where Kaneda changed into a different figure according to Laurier's view until she had to postpone her mission. Laurier also became confused because of Kaneda's drastic change. She was like an observer of the boy in front of her. Even after the bad rumors about Kaneda, who always harassed female servants, now the child had changed into a different person. He was even willing to fire the female servants and stay away from women, as if he showed disgust toward their presence. Laurier felt Kaneda's change was only temporary, and she labeled Kaneda as a fraud. For some time Laurier had observed Kaneda's change, and miraculously Kaneda had changed far better, and her intention to commit murder became cancelled because according to her Kaneda's change must be welcomed well. In her daydream she unconsciously ignored Kaneda's call, and after realizing it Laurier approached the little boy in front of her. This time she was ready to serve Kaneda well, because actually she also did not like if she committed murder. It was time for Kaneda to enter the Royal Academy. Kaneda got down from his horse cart accompanied by his 3 bodyguards. Kaneda stared closely at the tall building in front of him. He even looked in admiration at the ornaments on the Academy building. In the end, Kaneda's dream to study at the Royal Academy had come true, and one of his dreams to become a magic expert would soon be realized. The Royal Academy was something that must be achieved by Kaneda. That day he began to dare to register independently to become a student of the Royal Academy. But it seemed his father doubted Kaneda's ability. Kaneda's father always tried to make sure whether his child wanted to follow the insider path that had been provided by his father. But it seemed Kaneda had no intention of cheating because he had trained so much with Mint to be able to enter the Royal Academy. Kaneda was confident in his ability. Therefore he felt no need to trouble his father. The father could not dodge. He only obeyed all his child's words and did not protest at all. Kaneda walked along the corridor where the new Royal Academy students would register. Of course Kaneda saw so many rivals, but he was not afraid at all. The journey was quite far for Kaneda. The vastness of the Royal Academy made him a little difficult to reach the reception desk until finally the intended place was visible. Kaneda registered himself, filling all the forms that had been given, and he felt there was something that stuck in his heart because according to him the atmosphere where he would become a new student was the same as other worlds. Kaneda felt something strange toward his own feelings. The room Kaneda would head to was already provided. He looked in all directions how many rivals that Kaneda had to defeat to be able to enter as one of the Royal Academy students. There was something that made Kaneda curious. The crowd he saw was a group of people who looked down on and stared contemptuously at a boy. The presence of the child made people become noisy because they felt a very strong magic aura inside the child. But because the magic aura thrown by the boy was rare magic and considered legendary, they considered the figure standing upright in the hall trivial. Not infrequently, they also mocked the child by saying that the child had no talent. There was one thing wrong, but Kaneda did not want to interfere in that scene. He only became an observer, while the parents of the boy, who was mocked because he had no magic ability, tried to confirm again the statement from the judges where his child had no magic ability. He felt unacceptable about it. The boy who initially stood firm with full confidence immediately fell when he heard the mockery about the magic ability he did not have. Even the boy looked calmed by his older sister because he was already weak. Vanity Zero. That was the name of the boy who had no magic ability to be proud of. At this moment Kaneda only stared closely at Van's figure, who was being humiliated by many people. Even his own bodyguard also said that Van was a failed figure, even though he was the eldest son of Duke Zero, who occupied a respected family lineage. A show that was so entertaining, but also a show that made the noble family ashamed where the Duke who was a hero had a child who had no magic ability. He was so angry and dragged his child while Van still tried to defend himself. But his father did not care because it was already too embarrassing. That was the first sight seen by Kaneda when he stepped foot in the Royal Academy. This time Kaneda realized one thing. What he saw was like a prologue of the story. Kaneda knew that later if Van would experience difficult situations for some time, but he was gifted with good friends, and several years later Van would become a successful figure. Especially when the Academy examiner talked about the legendary 12th and non-attribute magic users. According to Kaneda's understanding, something magical would happen to Van. Many talks about Van made Kaneda decide to take a quick step. He realized that Van had an important role in the story. Therefore, he decided to approach him so that later he could get greater benefits. The atmosphere began to be controlled. Therefore, now it was time for Kaneda to show his ability. And it turned out surprisingly Kaneda successfully entered the Royal Academy because his magic ability was starting to increase. Of course, that made Kaneda's father feel happy. He even hugged his son with so much pride until Kaneda was made embarrassed because of his father's attitude that spoiled him so much. Kaneda was also a little worried because his father's words touched on the child from the Duke family. But it seemed his father did not care about all that because according to him, as long as they had money the Duke family was nothing, and it was only a trivial thing. It could be ascertained that Kaneda's journey this time would be smooth, especially since his father planned to donate a lot of money to Kaneda's school so that his child could be respected by the people around him without the slightest intimidation. One thing that made Kaneda feel relieved was that the background of his life story had changed, and he met the figure of Van, who would become his next target. The days where Kaneda did intense magic training had become normal for him, especially since Kaneda had no other activities besides honing his magic. Various kinds of spells that Kaneda had recited made him look a little strange in the eyes of his bodyguards. This is Kaneda's story that had just begun. His life would face challenges, so he had to be stronger. Why be limited? Therefore, training in magic was one way so that the marker could survive in his current world. It was not without reason. Even Kaneda was considered weird by his bodyguards, and he did not care about it at all because his main focus was to improve his magic to become the greatest. While Kaneda trained, luckily there was nothing that made him feel disadvantaged or harm others because he was truly serious about increasing his magic purely. Kaneda was so confident. He was sure that he would become number one for some time ahead, especially since Van, who according to him looked like the main character, had been expelled from the Duke family. And this was an opportunity that Kaneda must not waste. Kaneda would enjoy the times where he did training at the Royal Academy. Kaneda imagined how happy he would be when he got the chance to start a new life again in a different world, and of course he would enjoy it and train diligently to improve his magic. Of course, however, he he was made gloomy because many things stuck in Kanita's heart. Kanita sat on an empty chair with a gaze that could not be interpreted at all. Kanita hoped that in his current life he would live calmly, and maybe that would happen, or maybe the opposite. And that was what made Kanita feel worried. Bullying. Kanita did not expect that his calm days would soon end. Basically, Kanita could not socialize with many people. He tended to become a quiet child, so he felt a little unconfident, especially since he did not have friends to just talk or discuss with. With his hobby of being alone, many people hated him. At this moment, he was faced with 3 boys who were talking badly about him. Kanita realized he should not have become a quiet and cold-hearted figure, especially having to build connections as the heir to the Gordo Trading Company. But he did not do that at all, and only stayed silent waiting for a miracle to happen. After being approached by 3 boys who were in the same class as Kanita, now Kanita had to be slapped with the mockery thrown by those children where they said that he was a lowly person who was able to buy titles for his own interests. They also said that Kanita entered the superior class certainly because of his parents' donations. Those children also told Kanita to close his father's company. The sign that he could not understand was that in the new world he was in there were still types of bullying that made him feel uncomfortable. Maybe if it was the old one he would whine and complain to his father. Different from Kanita now who thought more coldly, because Kanita also realized that fighting noble children would not solve the problem, especially since he also could not throw money at them, so they would not intimidate Kanita. Kanita stayed silent. He did not move at all until suddenly, surprisingly, there was a figure who appeared to save Kanita. Kanita did not even know them because one was a beautiful woman figure, and the other was a blonde-haired man whom Kanita had never met at all. The intimidation felt by Kanita instantly ended when the 2 people who came suddenly saved him and gave some advice to warn the noble children whom he considered naughty. The words of the man who had just approached Kanita made the noble children shiver in fear, and Kanita with his cold gaze looked at the figure in front of him intensely, as if guessing how powerful the man in front of him was. With just a few words, the children who bullied Kanita immediately knelt and apologized to the blonde-haired man who had just come. That was why Kanita felt that the man had power later in the Royal Academy. Kanita just realized, when seeing how powerful the man was, the 3rd prince of the Broston Kingdom, Pickles Broston, and the woman accompanying him, namely the prince's fiancée Rosa Zero. And in reality Rosa was the sister of Vanity Zero, who was the main character in the story guessed by Kanita. Kanita was not an arrogant person. He was just not good at socializing. So because Pickles had saved him, he expressed his thanks while bowing his body. And the surprising thing was also heard by him, where Pickles apologized to Kanita for the careless actions of the noble children. At that moment Kanita felt Pickles looked so cool and full of authority. Pickles, that man, was hard to guess by Kanita, especially since Kanita did not expect that the figure of a high noble child would ask him to be friends. If he realized they were indeed in the same class, only because there was only he did not understand why the man wanted to be friends with him, and Kanita also did not know the reason Pickles wanted to be friends with him. So he felt there was something he did not know, and Kanita tried to avoid bad events happening to him. The thing Kanita did not know made him doubtful to build a friendship with Pickles, but it seemed Pickles did not care because he said he wanted to hang out with Kanita. Really, such a heavy first day. Even Kanita could not guess what would happen next at the Royal Academy, where he was currently studying. The footsteps that were initially unsteady now had become firm again. He did not want to show his weak side to his 3 bodyguards, so he acted more confidently and stared straight at his bodyguards. Kanita's arrival was warmly welcomed by his 3 bodyguards, especially Basil. He looked so enthusiastic, asking whether the days Kanita spent at his new school went smoothly. Of course Kanita lied that he felt quite happy there. Meanwhile Crescent realized there was something wrong with his master. He was even sensitive that Kanita might have experienced intimidation from noble children until he offered himself to teach a lesson to the children who did not know themselves who had bullied Kanita. Kanita felt his heart start to warm because his bodyguards paid so much attention to him. But Kanita did not want to worsen the atmosphere because fighting would not solve the existing problem. And when hearing Kanita's statement, Crescent nodded firmly even though he felt his action would not be wrong because it was in accordance with what he had learned. Kanita began to step into his horse cart. He also informed the result that he would stop by briefly on the way home. Of course the order was accepted by Basil. He knew that Kanita would shop and the like. The journey was quite far already traveled by Kanita until now he was at his house safely. staring at the table that was already filled with various kinds of tools he bought. Kanita's convincing gaze and the heavy breath released by the child indicated that this time he was serious and could not be disturbed. Many ornaments on Kanita's table were the magic tools that Kanita had just bought after returning from the Royal Academy. Kanita wanted to experiment with new magic he had, of course using the magic tools he had just bought. Kanita bought the magic tool not without reason, because Mint told him to, because the woman knew that Kanita only had magic talent for the dark attribute, and scientifically Kanita would not be able to use fire or ice magic. But according to Mint's statement, by applying magic power to objects, Kanita would be able to use magic with attributes that normally could not be used by Kanita. Of course, all of that could only be supported by the magic tool that Kanita had just bought. Kanita wanted to experiment with his magic using magic objects like what he remembered, where Mint gave an example of using fire on an arrow and changing it into a fire arrow. According to Kanita, that was very extraordinary to master. Now it was time for Kanita to experiment using the magic object he bought. Kanita recited some spells while playing with his hands, and his experiment succeeded even though Kanita was a little disappointed that he could not do more. This time Kanita could only use magic and his magic warmth only to make decorations on his watch. That was the first step taken by Kanita, and he moved safely. The function of Kanita's watch had now changed, where when Kanita wore the watch his presence would not be felt by people. He seemed to disappear and be unseen, and that made him feel cooler. After finishing the experiment, of course Kanita had to test his watch whether the watch really made him transparent, and his presence could not be realized by people. This time Kanita sneaked looking for prey that he would prank. Of course this time he found Crescent, who was walking in the corridor of his house. Mischievous thoughts began to envelop Kanita's brain. He spontaneously followed his bodyguard and hugged Crescent's tail. Kanita was so confident this time, so he felt very happy, but something surprising happened. His presence was actually realized by Crescent, even though he had already used his transparent watch. The first attempt failed. Kanita did not understand why his presence could be detected by Crescent. He even explained to Crescent that he had used dark magic on his watch to erase Kanita's presence, so it would not be tracked by Crescent. But of course Crescent gave a reasonable argument. It was not that Kanita's experiment failed, but Kanita's method was wrong, where Crescent explained that even though Kanita hid his presence, people could still realize Kanita's presence when Kanita made physical contact with them. And that was understood by Kanita because Crescent's explanation was quite reasonable. This is the flashback where Kanita stopped by the shop selling magic items. There he met an old man selling those magic items. At the reception desk, Kanita asked for some items he would buy. Of course the request was approved by the shop owner, where at that time Kanita asked for a watch and also a small gem as an ornament for the watch he would use. The shop owner's hands were so quick and skillful. He immediately took the watch, which according to him was very suitable when worn by Kanita. Of course, because he immediately saw the physical of the watch. Kanita's eyes scrutinized every inch of the watch in his grasp. After some time making sure whether the watch given by the shop owner functioned or not, Kanita's eyes began to move, examining something within his sight, because Kanita saw there was a book displayed on the reception desk, even not held at all by the shop owner. So he was a little curious, and asked what book was lying on the table until the owner did not read it at all. The shop owner admitted that the book was his grandfather's, but he was just not good at reading. However, he was sure that the book was very valuable, because how could that ancient book be kept if it had no value? Kanita felt curious, of course. The book he saw looked very mysterious, especially when the shop owner offered it to Kanita to be bought by him. The surging curiosity made Kanita buy the book. Maybe the book had sacred power unknown to many people, because ancient books might store a secret that could be utilized by Kanita. Back to the time where Kanita had finished making his experiment watch, where the watch when worn made the wearer transparent and would not be seen by people. But it seemed this time it did not apply to the figures of Pickles and Rosa. Kanita was so confident passing through the corridors of the Royal Academy, especially since at first Kanita's presence was not realized by the three people who intimidated him yesterday. So he was very sure with his new magic ability in the magic watch he created. But all of that was brushed aside, like you know that Pickles and Rosa realized Kanita's presence. Even the two of them greeted Kanita, until Kanita had to act politely to them, even though Kanita himself wanted to avoid it. Kanita felt there was something strange because other people did not realize Kanita's presence, but Pickles and Rosa knew about it, Or maybe Pickles and Rosa had such a high level of magic that Kanita's presence could be guessed by them. After greeting Kanita, Pickles and Rosa went ahead of the boy. Meanwhile, on the other side, Kanita became a reliable eavesdropper where he heard all of Pickles' words to Rosa, where Pickles asked whether Rosa's magic had increased. But in reality, Rosa did not make any level, especially since she had searched ancient books and gone to forbidden areas to look for the book she wanted to increase her magic. But what could be done? She obtained nothing. The result was so nihil. When hearing that, Kanita realized one thing where Rosa had to do her best because she was replacing her brother Van, who could not join the Royal Academy. Kanita's casual words about Order Zero attribute magic, which had similarities with the legendary 12th attribute magic, made Pickles and Rosa's journey stop instantly. They were very curious how Kanita could say that. Of course, Pickles and Rosa felt shocked because of Kanita's very strange words regarding the attribute magic that Kanita had just said was something impossible to exist. Even they were so curious that they were forced to stop their steps and turned to Kanita to ask for further explanation. Really, Kanita had no intention at all. He thought that Pickles and Rosa already knew about the existence of immeasurable attribute magic, so Kanita started to panic himself. He even waved his hands as a sign that he had no authority to give explanation because Kanita felt that Pickles and Rosa already knew more things than Kanita, especially remembering that the two of them were heirs of the kingdom and duke. And Kanita thought that at least among the two of them had read the old version of the history book of their nation's founding. Wait, Rosa's reaction was not the reaction wanted by Kanita. He did not expect that the woman in front of him would show her surprised reaction, especially since Kanita also saw how Pickles did the same until Kanita felt all his hairs stand on end. The reaction of those two people was so frightening according to Kanita. There was something strange realized by Kanita when Pickles said that there was only the new version of the history book of the nation's founding circulating, and Kanita's guess was correct. There was something wrong, but he tried to dodge about the meaning that Kanita had just said regarding the old version book of their nation's founding. Kanita tried to explain realistically that if there was a new version book, then of course there was also an old version book. That was done by Kanita to avoid suspicion from Pickles and Rosa. This time Kanita made a big mistake because Pickles explained that only a handful of people knew that there was an old version book of the history of their kingdom's founding, especially if they were ordinary people and not royal descendants. People would only know the latest version book circulating now. Realizing his mistake made Kanita start to grumble, annoyed because he had no information at all about the two versions of the kingdom's founding history book that he currently lived in. Rosa also chimed in Pickles' words where the old version history book of their kingdom's founding had been burned completely because of the war. He chose to stay silent and muttered, showing amazement at his own knowledge. Kanita's strange behavior and movements made Pickles realize, and he tried to interrogate Kanita, where he hoped that Kanita's words were indeed true if there was an old version of the kingdom's founding history book. And Pickles also did not want to lose the opportunity where he asked whether Kanita had the book, especially since the book was something tightly locked in the kingdom's forbidden library, and only the king was allowed to read the contents of the book. Pickles' words were so piercing to Kanita's heart. Even at this moment, Kanita showed his firm side, hearing every explanation that Pickles threw at him while staring sharply at Pickles, trying to challenge his interlocutor. Something heavy had happened. However, Kanita wanted to avoid it because his statement that there was an old version book of the kingdom's founding history made his day this time have to face Pickles and Rosa, and that would be very tiring. Therefore, Kanita tried to dodge. Kanita even showed his frequent laughter, and then said how could he possibly have the book, especially since he was not a noble descendant from the royal family, and also not a king who could have the book. Not wanting to add many problems in his life, Kanita chose to turn away, leaving the figures of Pickles and Rosa. But his departure was of course blocked by Rosa, because the girl still asked for explanation. But Kanita chose as if he did not hear any call from Rosa or Pickles. The atmosphere began to turn hot and awkward. Kanita's footsteps instantly stopped when he was blocked by Pickles and Rosa. Pickles seemed to threaten Kanita, where he asked Kanita to keep secret anything he would know about the old version kingdom founding history book. Pickles asked Kanita to keep all that secret, and if Kanita was willing to stay silent and not state anything about that sensitive matter, then he would be safe. Pickles' words were very challenging for Kanita, so he tried to be firmer and challenge Pickles back with all his words. But on the other side, Rosa asked Kanita to give all kinds of information about the old version kingdom founding book, because that way Rosa could help her brother Van. No, Kaneda still remained in his stance. This time he stayed silent, even it crossed his mind that he would ask Mint's figure to teach him history lessons so he would not be fooled by others again. Because his carelessness this time made him indirectly reveal a secret that he should have kept and known himself. It had gone too far for Kaneda. The thing that should have been known only by him made him have difficulties, and even dragged into one of the rooms in the Royal Academy, where the room was specially established for the royal family. Kaneda's complicated presence, of course, made his 3 bodyguards watch Kaneda behind the door, afraid that Kaneda later would be in a difficult situation, and to make access easier, Basil and Crescent stood guard. On the other side inside the room, Kaneda was faced by Pickles and Rosa, where they always pressured Kaneda to give explanation about why he could know that there was an old version book of the kingdom's founding history. Pickles realized that Kaneda looked so wary toward the two of them, so Pickles explained that the room where they were at that time was a room protected by magic, where every word they said would not be heard by outsiders. So whatever Kaneda said, only the 3 of them would know. Kaneda was silent for a moment. He tried to neutralize his irregular heartbeat because Kaneda thought about revealing what he knew about the old version kingdom founding history book. As if not wanting to get involved too far with Pickles and Rosa, Kaneda decided firmly, and at that instant Kaneda took out the book he bought from the magic item merchant he met yesterday. Kaneda took out the book that should have been a secret for many people. The old version book of the kingdom's founding history was clearly visible, looking so ancient. When Pickles and Rosa saw the book taken out by Kaneda, they did not expect that they could see the original version book of the kingdom's founding history. Of course, Pickles asked how Kaneda could get such a rare book that should have been extinct. Clearly, Kaneda did not want to lie and prolong the problem. He explained that he got the book from the public library, especially since the book was initially about to be thrown away by the library owner, and because of that Kaneda chose to pick up the book because he thought the book was just an ordinary book and would not affect many people. But in reality, after Kaneda read all its contents and explained to Pickles and Rosa, it turned out the book was an extraordinary book. This time, according to Kaneda's analysis, he knew why this book was destroyed in the religious war, because this book had history that would cause division when conflicting with the latest history book. Because Kaneda realized that the book was very important, he chose to release the book and give it to Pickles because Pickles was a royal person, but Pickles did not want to accept it. He was afraid it would become a problem later, until finally Rosa decided to take care of the book. Rosa took the forbidden book. She knew that the book would bring disaster to her, but she had no other choice because Rosa was determined to help her brother so he could learn magic and practice it. It felt selfish if Pickles did not want to know the contents of the forbidden book, so he asked Rosa and Kaneda to accept it so they could read the contents of the book together. And of course Kaneda did not feel it was a problem. It was just that he did not want to get involved further, and Kaneda asked that Pickles and Rosa keep secret that they got the book from Kaneda. After going through such a complicated conversation, Kaneda decided to leave the room, and when he came out of the room, of course, Kaneda was welcomed by the presence of Basil and also Crescent. Crescent saw how Kaneda's expression was so tired, so he asked whether Kaneda was okay, and that was brushed aside by Basil, so as not to be too curious about the master's affairs. On the other side, Kaneda felt relieved because he already had ties with 2 powerful people in the academy, and that would have a good impact on his father's business because he already had relations with the royal side. It would be very beneficial later if Kaneda's family could cooperate with the royal family. Kaneda's difficult day felt easier because he had bodyguards who understood him. He even felt his bodyguards were already like friends or best friends. He also even pranked Crescent by playing with the man's tail until it made Crescent throw a little protest. In the rather quiet urban area, when Kaneda saw Van's figure, he chose to follow the man. Even Kaneda specially made time in his free schedule to try to approach Van. It was not without reason why Kaneda was busy following the man, because he wanted to get relations from Van, where later in the future Van would become an extraordinary figure, and of course it would benefit Kaneda. Behind the wall here, Kaneda faintly followed Van's steps until finally he dared to sit next to Van following the man's activities. To perfect his alibi, Kaneda tried to buy the same item as Van so he would not be suspected by Van later. Kaneda's strategy was so extraordinary. He approached Van very easily. Even Kaneda also greeted Van so casually and then speculated that their meeting was an extraordinary coincidence. Kaneda tried to speak casually, inviting Van to chat with a little small talk when seeing Van shopping. Even their shopping packages were the same until Kaneda gave a warning to Van to keep paying attention to his shopping items so he would not forget. But behind Kaneda's words he was silent as if giving a warning, especially since Kaneda's sly face was so clearly visible. Whatever plan Kaneda would do to Van, it was clear that at this moment Van did not look wary at all with Kaneda's presence beside him. Van's suspicion was also completely absent until Kaneda could relax. Kaneda's words were swallowed by Van, where this time Van took his shopping items. Even he did not forget to check the contents of his shopping items for fear that his shopping items were swapped with Kaneda's. Sure enough, Van's shopping items were swapped. He took Kaneda's, but Van did not realize it at all because the contents of their shopping items were the same. Kaneda, who saw how Van took his shopping, made Van feel relieved. He was so satisfied because his plan succeeded. There was no suspicion at all from Van toward Kaneda. The boy was so relaxed because the shopping items he had confirmed as his had been taken by him. Kaneda only spoke briefly to Van, and that was it. He had no intention of having a long conversation with the boy because his goal was only one: to swap his shopping items with Van's so his mission could be carried out. Kaneda chose to excuse himself, leaving Van, and of course the boy had no problem if left alone because he was already used to doing his work and going through his days alone. Kaneda walked along every corridor he passed while carrying the shopping items he successfully swapped with Van's. Of course his action could be read by Crescent because his bodyguard was very sensitive. Back to Kaneda's previous memory where he negotiated with Rosa, and from the negotiation result Kaneda started doing his mission to approach Van subtly, and as compensation Rosa would buy items sold by Kaneda's family. That was why Kaneda's help to help Rosa was not free, but there was a very big reward. Kaneda, without thinking long, tried to agree to Rosa's request, especially since he really needed relations from the girl, so his father's trading company would develop even faster later. Rosa explained in detail the core problem of her family, how Van had been expelled from the Duke family, and Rosa's mother also became a victim of her father's anger until the two of them were expelled, and the noble status of Van and Rosa's mother was revoked. Rosa was so worried about her brother and mother, especially since they only had a little money to survive. Then Rosa thought her brother and mother could not live well because they had long been used to living luxuriously as nobles. The reason why Rosa asked for help from Kaneda was because she felt Kaneda could help her brother because Kaneda could move freely and was not monitored by the Duke family's bodyguards. Kaneda tried to understand every inch of Rosa's words, where Rosa asked him to become an intermediary who gave material support to Van. Actually, Kaneda felt doubtful. He was not that broad to help Rosa, especially since the Gordo trading company owned by his father was still monitored by the nobles in any situation. That was why he did not want to make choices that would damage his father's company reputation, because his father had struggled so hard so that his trading company became as big as it is now. Seeing how Kaneda doubted helping Rosa, Pickles tried to convince Kaneda that if later Kaneda's company had problems, he would give support to Kaneda's company. Even he promised to protect Kaneda's company if something bad happened. Pickles did all that because Van was his good friend who deserved to be fought for. Finally, with the persuasion spoken by Rosa and Pickles, it made Kaneda's heart melt. He was even willing to help the two of them become an intermediary. Of course, everything Kaneda did was not free. Therefore, they also risked their noble titles, and Kaneda risked his father's trading company image. But before that was done, Kaneda would ask for his father's approval, because anyway this involved the reputation of the company managed by his father. Actually, Kaneda felt heavy-hearted, but he also did not want to waste the golden opportunity that could make him far more famous by having relations with the royal noble family. Kaneda's negotiation with Rosa and Pickles was finished. It was time for Kaneda to rest himself in his luxurious house. But of course he did not really rest, but Kaneda chose to talk to his father about the problem he faced. Kaneda began to dare to face his father. He told how he negotiated with the daughter of the Duke family, namely Rosa. According to the existing plan, Rosa would buy high-value jewelry to the Gordo company, and the results from the many profits obtained would at least be given to the Duke family's boy, meaning Van. His father listened to how Kaneda explained. He knew that Kaneda's step this time was not something very detrimental to his company, especially since the Gordo company would benefit more. Therefore, Kaneda's father tried to accept his child's proposal. The relations built by Kaneda this time would give great rights and privileges to the Gordo company in the future, especially since they were dealing with the Duke family and the royal family. So according to Kanita's prediction in the future, they would definitely be more respected by many people and trusted as a trading company. Seeing how his child thought made his father a little proud, because he felt his child had succeeded in becoming a baron who was crazy about power and position. The risk of what Kanita would go through if he helped Rosa was certainly very big. But Kanita's father knew that if you want to succeed, then you must have big risks too. That was why Kanita's father approved his child's idea. He allowed Kanita to take that big risk. But still Kanita's father worried about his son. He even warned Kanita that Kanita's safety was the main priority above anything, and Kanita's father would also try to protect Kanita. Seeing how enthusiastic his child was and Kanita's very significant change made his father proud. His father knew that Kanita was not a figure who was good at socializing, but this time Kanita succeeded in building connections even beyond his father's expectations. So proud was the father toward Kanita that the old man carried Kanita so that Kanita floated in the air. The expression of love and pride from the father to Kanita made Kanita's feelings warm. He even promised he would not bring problems that would harm his father and the Gordo company. However, Kanita's father, who was already experienced, reminded Kanita not to trust the nobles too much because the nobles might betray Kanita. Only this time Kanita felt such great affection from his father. Even when Kanita took his decision so heavy and would harm his father, the father still chose to protect Kanita. That hug explained everything, where Kanita felt his presence was very appreciated and so loved by his father. Back to the time where Kanita swapped his shopping items with Van's. He began to check the contents of the package he carried, and Kanita saw one red apple that was currently in his grasp. If thinking about how his father very much supported Kanita, it made his heart vibrate, because Kanita remembered in his previous life he died miserably without thinking about his parents, and this time the signs would not do the same. He was determined to be more attentive to his parents who currently supported him. And now the apple in his grasp he gave to Crescent as a thank you, because Crescent had become his loyal bodyguard without doing bad actions toward him. Meanwhile, Crescent, who was indeed already hungry, accepted Kanita's gift without small talk. Half the negotiation conducted by Kanita with Rosa. This time, he began to launch his mission, where Kanita tried to protect Van from people who always protected him. This was the time for Kanita. The way he protected Van and the boy's mother was quite easy. He only recited the magic spells he had by always playing his fingers. Kanita recited spells to cover people's view so they could not see the house occupied by Van. In other words, the house had been protected by Kanita's magic spells, where no one could disturb Van and his mother from danger or evil people's disturbance. Van's mother also occasionally thanked Kanita. She saw how her child's development was quite rapid. Kanita saw from afar the result of his efforts. The training done by Van made a smiling tone. He did not expect that the figure of the boy expelled by his father was so tough and always tried to show the best. Van was serious in his training. He held his wooden sword tightly and gave a lot of resistance to Crescent. Even Crescent praised Van's ability that developed quite rapidly. Van's sword ability was also not bad. Van did not want to lose. He did not want to give up at all. That was why he still thrust his wooden sword as a sign that he was not tired at all and still wanted to train sword with Crescent. Meanwhile, on the other side, Basil and Olive only became spectators of Van's fight along with Crescent. They observed how the child was so persistent to defeat his opponent. Van's persistence was what made Kanita remember again how Van was known as a hero and the main character in the story in the world he currently lived in. Even after being expelled from the Duke family, Van began to live with his mother. Even they lived calmly in the city center. Van's facial expression that was currently trying to parry and give resistance to Crescent's attack clearly showed that he had persistence and hidden talent in swordsmanship. Kanita began to observe Van again. He felt he did not understand why Van did not have magic energy in his body, even though as far as Kanita knew Van had quite high talent. Many magic sciences were absorbed by Van's body, and it seemed Van had a strange constitution according to Kanita. Another thing that could be known about the level was that Van could neutralize magic attacks. That was why Kanita speculated that Van was the main character in a story. Yes, Kanita's view of Van would not be wrong anymore. Van's ability that was not relevant to magical things made Kanita decide to give training to Van. That situation made Kanita decide to make Van train non-attribute magic, because it would be very suitable for the boy he was currently observing. Kanita did not release his bodyguards just like that. He had given permission beforehand, where his 3 bodyguards said that Van asked them to teach him war science, and of course they would not train Van if there was no approval from Kanita's mouth. Kanita was clear on how Crescent said that Van asked him to do training because Van wanted to become strong enough to protect his mother and everything he wanted to protect. And that was also chimed in by Olive and Basil. Wasn't he also going to benefit if Van became a figure respected by many people? That was why his 3 bodyguards gave extra training to Van right in front of Kanita. At first, when he saw his 3 bodyguards so close with Van, Kanita acted normally, but over time he felt something stuck in his heart. Kanita felt uncomfortable, and only then he realized that he felt jealous of Van's presence. Kanita felt like he was at a level so far from Van, and that made him feel threatened. The empty gaze scrutinizing the bodyguards and Van in front of him described how clear the envy was in Kanita's heart. But he still tried to be realistic, and he did not want his envy to destroy his plans just like that, especially since he could not possibly really be jealous of a 10-year-old child while he himself was mature enough to think thoroughly. But Kanita was still human. He felt jealous of people who were blessed with appearance and also talent. Van's presence made Kanita feel his position was starting to be threatened, even though he had finally begun to find peace in his heart little by little. But everything did not go smoothly. Talent far higher than Kanita's made him become a hypocrite, even though he himself knew that he was the one who gave permission to his bodyguards to give training to Van. But after Kanita saw all that, it felt like Van's eyes became painful, even though he knew Van's presence had no evil intention. Van, who was quite cheerful with captivating appearance, was enough to make Kanita feel that the man was not his match. Kanita felt he was so small even since his previous life, because he felt he was a worthless human, never becoming a special person for anyone. It was very selfish for Kanita if he started to think that he would become the main character in a story. His dream was only an illusion after reincarnating. Kanita felt his head was already full. He even massaged his head so that the pain would subside. Kanita realized one thing. Van's relationship with his bodyguards was pure, like best friends who supported each other to achieve success, while Kanita himself only played around with the bodyguards and slaves he bought with money. It was truly something so different when viewed by eyes and mind. There was a feeling of disappointment in Kanita's heart that his belonging was no longer intact. That was why he thought he had to invite his bodyguards to explore the outside world, because one day later Kanita would definitely be faced with even greater disappointment, where he would release his bodyguards. If that happened later, he might not experience big losses from his own choice, because basically the presence of the bodyguards and slaves was only bound by a contract that could be terminated by Kanita. Basil, Olive, and Crescent, when those people of course would not always be with Kanita. Even Kanita would continue to grow, and when the time came Kanita would no longer need them, or more precisely, they would no longer want Kanita. To minimize the pain from being left, Kanita decided to act normally. Even at this moment, he began to release his 3 bodyguards, because according to him, one day later his bodyguards would realize that Kanita was not an interesting person, and he was a boring person without the slightest charm in Kanita's self, just like in Kanita's past life. This time Kanita would not try harder to attract people's attention because he did not want them to feel regret when they decided to leave Kanita. Yes, Kanita had always lived like that and would always be like that. On the other side, Olive's sharp glance at Kanita indicated that he realized there was something strange from Kanita's expression until he tried to make sure of Kanita's presence. Olive was a person sensitive to anything because of his instinct as a half-wolf human. With quickness, Olive approached Kanita. Even Olive's arrival could not be predicted by Kanita at all. The man was so agile. Olive was very curious why Kanita acted strange. That was why he asked whether there was something wrong until it made Kanita gloomy and looked not okay at all. Kanita was stunned. He did not expect that Olive was so sensitive and had strong instinct toward him, so Olive's question made Kanita even more pressured. Olive's sudden question made the atmosphere become silent instantly. Kanita realized that he could not answer anything. He even did not have the right to judge anyone. Kanita tried to lie to Olive. He said that he was okay, but the lie that came out of Kanita's mouth could not make Olive believe it just like that, especially when seeing Kanita's expression that changed to cold as if something had happened. Kanita's thoughts about himself began to make him become so, because there was no use if Kanita said anything to Olive, who most likely would be captivated by Van's charm, and soon Olive would be better to Van than to Kanita, who was only a supporting character. Olive did not understand why Kanita lied to him. That was why Olive stared straight at Kaneda, looking for a definite answer that he might find. The dark magic mastered by Kaneda had entered and been absorbed by Kaneda's body. All spells were recited by Kaneda where he wanted to strengthen his heart's firmness. Darkness magic began to appear where the anger thrown by Kaneda toward himself became a big opportunity to increase his ability. Kaneda realized that all of that was the first step when he headed toward success, becoming an extraordinary dark magician. But basically Kaneda also had to live with a burden that continuously pressed him, especially the darkness that threatened to overflow, causing a big disaster for Kaneda and even the people around him. Kaneda did not want to become evil. That was why he hoped that later Van could master non-attribute magic that erased the darkness in Kaneda's heart. Kaneda did not want to be reckless. He did not want to make all his dreams destroyed, even if he was only a supporting character in a story, but he had a comfortable and very rich life. That was why Kaneda wanted to get used to his role, because he had to enjoy all the luxury he got in his current life. Kaneda's thoughts about his current life made him brush aside all the envy in his heart. Even he was determined to become a quite good supporting character. Many things had been experienced by Crescent together with Kaneda. That was why the situation tried to trust Crescent. Kaneda invited Crescent to play a game similar to chess, until Kaneda decided to release the collar that bound Crescent's neck. Realizing something stuck in his sight, Basil, who saw Crescent no longer had the slave-binding collar, of course, asked what happened to Crescent's collar. Of course, he casually said that Kaneda gave him permission to move freely and release the collar that marked him as Kaneda's slave. Back to the time where Kaneda released Crescent's slave collar. The boy never gave any signal or sign where he would do something that could endanger himself. Kaneda began to trust Crescent. That was why he did not have the slightest fear toward his bodyguard, because he knew Crescent would not hurt him. Kaneda's spontaneous movement, of course, made Crescent feel annoyed, but he was also relieved when Kaneda decided not to snare Crescent with the slave collar that tormented him. There was a feeling of relief in Crescent's heart. Actually, he did not believe that his master would release him just like that. Crescent tried to warn Kaneda. Maybe Kaneda forgot that Crescent had an aggressive nature that could hurt Kaneda. But it seemed Kaneda did not mind that because he already had his own trust in Crescent, and Kaneda did not want to snare Crescent and make him obedient by force. Kaneda wanted their closeness because of the bond as a friend, best friend, and also bodyguard. The point was Kaneda wanted a pure relationship between himself and Crescent. Crescent did not understand Kaneda's attitude because he was not a person sensitive to the situation. It was just that Crescent still felt confused about Kaneda's decision to release the collar on his neck. Even Kaneda himself already knew that Crescent could hurt him, but Kaneda ignored Crescent's warning. That was why Crescent considered that Kaneda was a little strange. Crescent really did not know what was in Kaneda's mind, but what was clear at this moment, he felt his breath a little relieved, and Basil also told Crescent that Kaneda's thinking indeed could not be guessed by him. The conversation between Crescent and Basil stopped because Olive called them, so they prepared to escort Kaneda to go somewhere. Olive's words were understood. That was why Crescent and Basil prepared to carry out their duties. Kaneda's plan one by one began to be carried out. Even now Kaneda was seen visiting a luxurious church. Kaneda's journey this time was accompanied by Olive and Crescent until the three of them faced the church leader from the Broston kingdom. The figure of an old man with his white beard began to greet Kaneda. The one who knew the man was the priest of the church named Gatsuku. Gatsuku warmly welcomed Kaneda's arrival. He had even looked up the rumors circulating about Kaneda. Gatsuku did not feel threatened at all by Kaneda's presence. He seemed to show how powerful he was to manage the royal church. Kaneda's arrival this time was not without reason. He met Gatsuku because there was business he wanted to discuss where Kaneda wanted to talk about donations. More precisely, he would talk about money. Of course, if hearing the word money, everyone felt happy because money was one of the pleasures that made the world run much better. Gatsuku, who initially did not want to allow Kaneda in, when hearing the tone of wanting to talk about money, politely invited Kaneda to enter his room. Kaneda knew very well how people were crazy about money. That was why Kaneda wanted to take advantage of that momentum. Kaneda's arrival to the royal church, of course, could not last long because he would explain the purpose and goal of meeting Gatsuku briefly and without beating around the bush, because time is money. That was why Kaneda wanted to utilize every moment that existed. The plan that Kaneda had prepared firmly would take place. Therefore, he conducted negotiation with the church priest. Kaneda explained that his family would donate 7 gold coins to the church every month for a fairly long period, and 5 of them would be donated to increase the frequency of food distribution. But of course Kaneda did not want his help to be publicized. Then Kaneda would also give an additional 5 gold coins that would be donated personally to the church priest. So the total that would be donated by Kaneda every month was literally 12 gold coins, and he did not want his action to be known. Therefore he wanted the royal priest to keep his identity secret. Word after word thrown by the little boy in front of Gatsuku was listened to carefully by him, and he understood what Kaneda explained. There was no reason for Gatsuku to reject Kaneda's donation, especially since he also got a little profit from Kaneda. But it seemed Gatsuku tried to weigh the bad impact that would happen later. The old man was quick to respond to what would happen, so Kaneda tried to lobby the old man in front of him so he would cooperate with Kaneda, because everything Kaneda planned, of course, would not be realized if Gatsuku did not agree. It seemed it was not easy for Kaneda to lobby the church priest in front of him, but he had to try hard because that was the only way for Kaneda to be able to help distribute assistance for Van. The intense gaze that was so intimidating to Gatsuku made the old man break out in cold sweat. He was even reluctant to reject Kaneda's request because he was afraid of being preyed upon by the bodyguards Kaneda brought. Crescent's presence became its own advantage for Kaneda because the intimidating gaze from the man made Gatsuku have no other choice but to accept Kaneda's offer. Because Gatsuku accepted Kaneda's offer, of course the boy had prepared a sheet of paper to be signed by Gatsuku as a sign they conducted official cooperation. The contract paper was already in Gatsuku's hands. With a body shivering in fear, he tried to dare to hold and sign the contract that had been provided by Kaneda on the table. The contract paper between both parties had been signed by Gatsuku. What was not known by the old man was that Kaneda said that the contract that had just been signed by Gatsuku was already protected by black magic. So indirectly, if the old man violated the contract provisions, it would automatically trigger a type of punishment that could threaten Gatsuku. Kaneda's sly and piercing words made Gatsuku feel uneasy, especially when the little boy in front of him said that Gatsuku, who was the priest of the royal church, would never lie or violate what was written in the contract. Seeing how the old man in front of him began to show his fangs to Kaneda, Kaneda did a trick in the form of a threat that if later Gatsuku committed a violation, it would signal that Gatsuku raised the flag of religious war like what happened 300 years ago. According to Kaneda, if that happened, of course, he would not be disadvantaged. Therefore, he began to take advantage of the existing momentum to threaten the old man in front of him. Even Kaneda's gaze was so intense, describing how confident he was with every word he uttered. Kaneda was not afraid at all, even though he faced a religious figure. Kaneda's tactic made Gatsuku angry, the one who initially intended to give a signature, but his intention became cancelled. But of course Kaneda did not stay silent. He continued to dig all the information that existed and convey the bad things that would happen if the old man in front of him did not want to help Kaneda. That was why Gatsuku had no other choice. He even said that he would not be friends with Kaneda. But even though his words contradicted his actions, Gatsuku still gave his signature accepting all the contract agreement so Kaneda could give donations to the church. Of course, part of his donation had to be channeled to Van. Gatsuku's signature after it was finished was obtained by Kaneda. Of course, as the one who gave the contract, Kaneda checked whether the paper was officially usable. Kaneda also tried to calm the old man in front of him that he did not need to worry if Kaneda would betray him. But it seemed Gatsuku was reluctant to trust Kaneda because Kaneda's image was already too bad in front of him. Even the old man considered Kaneda was a naughty child, and of course after this he did not want to meet Kaneda because for him, besides Kaneda's face that was not pleasant to look at, Kaneda's nature was also annoying. Gatsuku also said that he really hated men because of his arrogant nature. On the other side, Kaneda also looked down on the old man in front of him. He said that coincidentally he also hated women, so he hoped they could get along for a fairly long time. And according to the agreement, the gold coin donation that would be channeled by Kaneda would start operating next month, counted from the contract signed by Gatsuku. Yeah, Gatsuku understood. He already felt tired of Kaneda's arrogant attitude, so he immediately drove the boy away. Really, Kaneda felt amused when he saw how angry the old man in front of him was until he felt like always pranking Gatsuku. After traveling long enough, now Kaneda arrived at the house where he did some of his activities. Of course, he was accompanied by his bodyguards who were always beside Kaneda. Kanita's arrival was welcomed by Basil. Occasionally Kanita looked right and left as if he was looking for something, and sure enough Kanita was looking for Laurier's presence, and he asked Basil where the servant's figure was. Already enough about Laurier. Then Basil asked Kanita whether Kanita met Van, because honestly Basil had liked Van's figure, because according to him Van was a very extraordinary child. Basil also wanted that later Kanita would give support to Van, because Van was an honest child. Actually, Basil's statement this time made Kanita shout for a moment. He felt disappointed, and he did not expect that this time his bodyguard had started to forget him. Maybe it was time for Kanita to release Basil. He even gave permission to his bodyguard to be able to meet Van alone if Basil wanted, but of course it had to be during Basil's free time. Clearly Basil's presence was believed to make Van happy. The words that were so contradictory. Actually, Kanita did not want to release Basil, but what could be done? He also could not hold his bodyguard because Kanita did not want to be selfish. This time Kanita chose to leave Basil. He did not want to talk about Van for some time because he wanted to neutralize his dislike when people who were already close to Kanita seemed to be taken by Van little by little. Basil felt there was something strange with Van. Usually his master was a quite cheerful child, but this time Basil saw Kanita become more gloomy. That was why Basil was afraid that he had made a mistake, because Kanita seemed not to care about him and acted strange. Kanita's steps became more unsteady without spirit. He walked along the corridor of his house alone without being accompanied by bodyguards. All of that was to calm himself, but unintentionally he met Laurier. Laurier of course clearly saw how Kanita looked so lethargic. Kanita did not want to prolong the problem. He knew that Laurier was not comfortable with him. Even Kanita also knew that Laurier wanted to resign, but for the umpteenth time Kanita also could not hold people to stay with him. He only gave the choice if they wanted to go. Kanita allowed it, but if they wanted to stay Kanita also felt grateful. Today Kanita felt quite tired. Therefore he did not want to prolong the existing problem and asked Laurier to prepare a glass of warm drink for Kanita to drink, and of course Kanita's request was carried out by Laurier. Kanita had no fighting spirit to live at all, proven when Crescent invited him to play chess. Kanita did not refuse that request. Really, he was already tired enough facing the reality that in the end Kanita would be alone again. He would be left by his trusted people. Every day Crescent and Olive asked about whose task they had to do. Still Kanita acted normally. He allowed his people to do anything they liked. Then after that Kanita chose to close the door. He threw his clothes anywhere, and today Kanita's heart was already chaotic enough. Kanita did not understand how he had to go through complicated days without people who would support him. Kanita's thoughts felt like tangled threads. Therefore, one way for him to fill energy was to lie down his body and sleep soundly on the bed. Kanita spontaneously threw his body. He thought by sleeping he could forget all the anxiety in his heart. Kanita slowly began to close his eyes, but in a half-conscious state, Kanita recited various spells that were unintentionally spoken by him, where he wanted to eliminate the anxiety in his heart. Really, Kanita wanted his life to be filled with good things. Until finally after Kanita mumbled, he began to sleep soundly on the bed without him realizing. At Van's residence, it was visible that the boy was washing his face. Water flowed on Van's handsome face. Even the boy looked at himself with the water pooling in the bucket. Van's face that was so perfect indicated that Van's handsomeness could not be measured by anything. Many people admired Van's personality and posture until his face shape that seemed like a carved statue, looking so beautiful. Today Van looked at his face sadly behind the pool of water. He remembered how his past as a noble and the eldest son of the Duke family, but that instantly disappeared, snatched by time, where now he had been expelled and erased from the Duke family. His father hated him because he thought Van did not have magic ability worthy of pride. Van remembered how his father pulled his shirt collar and slammed Van while saying that Van was a bastard who had embarrassed the Zero family. The heartache from his father's curses of course made Van feel failed. Van was angry. At first he cursed his father because he thought Van did not have magic ability. Even Van himself did not believe that. But it seemed Van's father did not care because he was already very embarrassed in front of many people for knowing how his child did not have magic ability worthy of pride. The incident where Van was humiliated in front of many people was clearly in his brain, especially when his mother begged his father to give leniency so Van could show his ability. But it seemed Van's father did not give any chance at all. Even his father directly expelled Van and his mother from the Duke family house, and worse, revoked their noble titles. Now Van lived as an ordinary person, and he knew as an ordinary person he had to try hard to earn a living so he could eat and fulfill daily needs. After becoming an ordinary citizen, only then Van knew that all the people who Van used to consider friends suddenly changed to cold and evil. And the food that Van used to consider normal now was very expensive, so it was difficult for Van to buy it. Really, Van felt ashamed of himself in the past because he was so spoiled. Van realized how stupid he was when he was still small. Van's grip that was so strong until his nails turned white as a sign that he was angry with the situation and disappointed with himself. For a fairly long time, when Van was thrown away by the Duke family and became an ordinary citizen, he only had two people who always supported him, namely Rosa his sister and Pickles his best friend, as well as the prince who was Rosa's fiancé. At least Van was still lucky to have the two of them. The question was indeed true that Van only had Rosa and Pickles who always supported him until one day Van met Kaneda. What Van knew was that Kaneda was the son of a merchant. Van was also good at uttering sharp words to every person he met. But Van felt something different, where Kaneda's treatment toward him was always polite and full of attention. Especially when Van was injured, Kaneda always brought medicine for him. In addition, Van gave him permission to train with the adventurers who guarded Kaneda. Of course, Van felt grateful for the many help given by Kaneda to him. Even according to Van, Kaneda himself already knew that he was no longer a noble who could support Kaneda's activities. Kaneda's presence that always supported Van, of course, was known by him. Van clearly saw how Kaneda tried to protect his residence, so Van's mother was always protected and not disturbed by strangers who tried to bring them down. Van also clearly knew how Kaneda was ordered by his sister to help Van. Van was not a stupid person, but he knew the consequences Kaneda took to help him were very big, and Van read the sincerity in Kaneda's heart to help him. Occasionally, Van heard that Kaneda had a miracle that had not been revealed. Therefore, Kaneda tried to persuade Van so Van would try to train non-attribute magic. But of course, Kaneda did not force Van to do it if he did not want to. Van saw how serious Kaneda was trying to convince him to learn magic again. At first, Van only stayed silent. He thought maybe Kaneda's words were only to entertain him, but his curiosity also began to appear. He really wanted to explore his ability, because anyway Van did not want to live as a loser. Realizing how much effort Kaneda made Van believe in his ability. With firm determination, Van decided to make proud the people who supported him. Clearly this time, Van was seen doing an attack to Crescent. Now they trained in a wide field. Van swung his wooden sword. He was determined to become stronger, so he would no longer burden many people. Van's fighting ability that was so slow made Crescent decide to test the child. Really, Crescent only intended to swing his sword casually, but in the end Crescent's attack made Van bounce to the ground. Crescent felt guilty. He actually did not intend to hurt Van. It was just that the strength he considered weak had a bad impact on Van. Van experienced a little injury on his knee, but he did not mind it and wanted to keep training again, but his movement was immediately blocked by Kaneda. Kaneda knew that Van was not okay, and if he forced himself it would have a bad impact on Van's body. Kaneda's concern made Van feel even more guilty, and his fighting spirit became twice as high so he would not disappoint Kaneda, who he already considered as his own best friend. Crescent, of course, felt guilty. He was afraid that later his career would be at stake until he apologized to Kaneda for making Van injured. As a result of the injury experienced by Van, it made Kaneda a little troubled. He had to give advice words again to Van, so the boy could obey him to treat Van's wound. But it seemed Van did not want to treat his wound because he hated when Kaneda applied disinfectant liquid that made him grimace in pain. But what could be done? Kaneda could only do that because if Kaneda used healing magic to heal Van's wound, that magic did not function at all because basically Van was immune to magic. After finishing training because Van experienced injury, finally Kaneda helped Van, who walked limping. Kaneda escorted Van to the boy's house because Kaneda wanted to treat Van, but his action was caught by Van's mother. Van's mother saw how Van experienced injury again after training swordsmanship. As the mother, of course, there was worry enveloping her when her child experienced injury, but Van did not want to see his mother worry too much. Meanwhile, on the other side, Kaneda became very jealous when he saw the warm scene between mother and child. After a little debate, finally Van treated his wound while pondering. There was a feeling of disappointment in Van's heart. He was afraid that later he could not give good reciprocity to Kaneda. Van was afraid that Kanita's good deeds could not be repaid by him, because basically at this moment Van was no longer a noble from the Duke family. Hearing how desperate Van was made Kanita try to comfort the boy in front of him. Of course Kanita hoped that Van could return to the Duke family, but even if not he would still help Van, because in truth Rosa's presence also had a good impact on the continuity of his father's company. On the other side, behind his words that were so calming for Van, Kanita began to realize one thing. Kanita wanted to become strong and do a lot of good deeds. Kanita wanted to do all that without showing off his strength that made people afraid. The sign of wanting to do that naturally was exactly like when he saw Van with his clean heart. He wanted to become like Van. That was the core of the anxiety that had been answered all this time. Kanita wanted to become a strong person with a clean heart. In the Royal Academy dorms, Rosa said that the first thing that started it all was the zero element. She felt that her brother, who might be compatible with attribute magic, was Vanity Zero. The girls said that if this was true, it might become history for the Zero ducal family to become very suspicious. So, she felt this was too much of a coincidence for the two boys. Hawk admitted that most of those coincidences and sudden miracles that people called destiny. When Rosa wondered about his meaning, Pickles guessed that they who were born in the same year and accidentally met at the same school was destiny. Hawk asked Pickles to drop that joke. He confessed he didn't know about the three of them, but he was sure he wasn't the type of person chosen by destiny. Pickles teased Hawk, who was once again talking badly about himself. However, Hawk reasoned that he was only being objective with this fact. Meanwhile, Pickles only stayed silent and observed the boy. He often heard bad things about the gold company, including the boy from them. Hawk was called a stupid child, arrogant, a womanizer pig, and an ugly pig child who truly looked exactly like his father. Pickles thought that it was unreasonable slander, but he realized if Hawk lived very spoiled by his father, it felt natural if his personality would be very distorted. That was why he was very surprised when he met Hawk for the first time. He saw the boy being bullied by other children. Hawk, who didn't stand out and wasn't firm, made him look like he didn't really care. He knew that Hawk viewed his surroundings with contempt because he realized that gaze, reminding him of himself when looking in front of a mirror. Because Pickles was the third prince of this country, since he was young, he had already seen various beautiful and bad things. He had grown up seeing many people and various things. That was the reason he helped Pickles without needing to be asked when the boy was being disturbed. Pickles smiled when remembering it. Then he asked Hawk if they were friends now. However, Hawk felt those words were too amazing for an ordinary low person like him. Pickles asked if that was true. Then Hawk confessed he had been in a difficult situation, so he would really be happy if Pickles restrained himself from saying anything that could put him in bigger trouble. Pickles laughed and confessed he was very grateful to have a friend like Hawk. His reaction made Rosa glance at him and observe the two of them. She wondered why an ordinary person like Hawk could be in Class A of the Academy, even when her brother was expelled from the noble family. But Pickles still said that Hawk was an interesting little boy. Rosa had heard gossip about the boy, judging him as vulgar, arrogant, a womanizer, and a bad person. However, if she looked at him without prejudice and malicious intent, he was an interesting person with an original and unique view. She remembered Hawk saying that he had heard many things said about the legendary 12th attribute that should never have existed, the 0th attribute. Rosa remembered when Hawk shared his thoughts about attributeless magic from a perspective they had never thought of and admitted that his opinion was correct. She started thinking about what it meant if Hawk was right, that there was nothing inside her brother. Moreover, she had never even thought of such a basic thing. She wondered what this world looked like in Hawk's eyes, making her curious about how they appeared and formed in his view. Rosa remembered when Hawk told the girl about Van, who greatly worried her and joked about his gratitude and regret. Hawk also gave her a letter from Van and asked her to reply to it as soon as possible if Rosa wanted. Hawk also informed her that he had spoken with the branch head of the goddess church in the kingdom regarding food distribution. Rosa confessed that Hawk was very brave and refined, and he truly far exceeded her expectations. The girl now also understood what made Pickles interested in Hawk. Then, Rosa started praising the two of them who could get along very closely, but she scolded them to think a little more seriously about attributeless starting from now. Pickles apologized to Rosa for that. Meanwhile, Hawk stayed silent. He then said that there was something he was thinking about. When Rosa asked what he meant, Hawk answered that it was the existence of absence and what kind of thing it was. Rosa and Pickles were surprised and curious about his meaning. Hawk explained that it should be nothing because there was nothing. He asked Pickles for his opinion that the idea was quite philosophical. Pickles admitted it, while Rosa felt it was a little strange. Hawk explained that if they wanted to train attribute magic skills, it would be good to mix the elements in their body with something that had elemental qualities. He said that Van believed he had no aptitude for magic. He knew that was the reason Van trained his body, because even without magic, he still wanted to have strength to fight. When Hawk commented on Van saying his element was useless, meaningless, and non-existent, suddenly Pickles interrupted by saying that it was the best way for someone without magic attributes to train. He felt Hawk's opinion was truly new and made him amazed. However, Hawk said that it was only a hypothesis. He took a donut and explained that a donut with a hole couldn't exist without a donut. Hawk questioned what made that absence not exist, saying there should be something there, but instead there wasn't. He felt the opinion that there was an absence, but also that something was something very philosophical and contradictory to logic. He expressed to them that it was truly interesting. Then, Hawk split his donut into two. He explained in this condition, he asked what happened to the donut hole for them, because if it was already split in half, there would be no more hole. He asked if the hole had disappeared, then ate it, making Rosa and Pickles laugh. When they were all about to end the day, Hawk gave something to Rosa and Pickles. It was a paper discussing why attributeless people were attributeless. The title made Rosa surprised. Hawk explained that even though the title was like that, it was actually a study on attributeless magic. Pickles commented on it, thinking that it was a little dangerous to have something like this here in the Branston Kingdom, where the Church of the Goddess was the main religion. Hawk expressed his view on the reason magic had no effect on Van. He said the content of the paper was somewhat vague, just in case. He also clarified that it was only his personal opinion regarding elemental and attribute magic. Hawk said anyone with sufficient magic knowledge should be able to understand the true meaning of the author. Pickles understood. However, Rosa was surprised because she felt it would be better if Hawk presented it instead of the girl. Hawk reasoned that if an ordinary naughty person like him presented it, it would be silenced or laughed at and completely shut down. Hawk expressed that research on attributeless people made sense. He also didn't mind if it was presented by Rosa. He said it would be fine if their names were mentioned at the end of the paper as recipients of thanks. Pickles understood that was the reason. Rosa also understood that it was a plan to help her brother. However, the three of them still didn't know that it was a pebble they threw into the water and became a small ripple that would soon become a big wave. An old man found it. Meanwhile, there was another danger targeting them. Their pursuers were people who ordered a group of people to kill as quickly as possible. The group agreed, and one of them was a maid at Hawk's place, Laurier. At the Scholars Guild, people were excited with the extraordinary concept from the paper because there was a way like that in thinking about attribute magic. They regarded this as the discovery of the century and wanted to invite the author of the paper, Rosa, to join them as soon as possible. After that, in front of a building, Hawk felt nervous. When someone called him, Hawk was surprised it was Pickles and Rosa. Rosa, who was nervous, asked Hawk what she should do. Hawk calmed her and explained something that surprised Rosa. Pickles then told Rosa to enter the royal quarters inside the dorm because there was a magic barrier there. Pickles stated that he never thought this would happen. Rosa also felt this would become a problem. Hawk confirmed that this truly became a problem. Rosa said she never thought she would be asked to skip classes and asked what she should do. Meanwhile, Hawk stayed silent and remembered the paper that at a glance looked like only a study on attributeless people. It had been sent under Rosa's name, but in reality it was only Hawk's revelation of thoughts about attributeless in a roundabout way. He prepared it to gain a little sympathy from them, but instead he attracted the attention of scholars and the Magician Guild until they contacted the author to directly enter the university. Hawk asked if they had no other choice besides refusing. However, Rosa said this was a good opportunity for people to realize about her brother. Rosa argued that the invitation to join the country's main research facility, the Scholars Association, until entering the university was an opportunity to help her brother that could not be missed. However, Hawk knew that Rosa also didn't really understand the content of the paper. When Rosa wanted to argue, Hawk said if they took a suspicious shortcut and made them stumble until their plan was exposed, those people who were unhappy with the truth about attributeless would take the chance and silence them. Pickles said if that happened, the impact those people would give was completely unimaginable. Rosa stayed silent. She confirmed and could not argue against it. Hawk argued they had no other choice besides giving up because it was the safest thing to do to pretend the matter about skipping classes had never happened. Hawk said there was no point in rushing for success and ending up falling too. He also argued that from the start Rosa's plan was too fragile because in this country the position of the Church of the Goddess was very strong. So, he asked to think ahead more carefully. Rosa confirmed it and apologized. Rosa felt this became in vain. She also had no choice but to refuse by revealing that the author of the paper was Hawk. However, suddenly someone said that wasn't the way. The three of them were surprised by the arrival of the old man, who was Principal Merlin. Hawk asked how he could be here and about the meaning of his earlier words. Meanwhile, Merlin told them they needed to be very careful. Then he commented on them being in trouble. However, Pickles was surprised because there should be a magic protector here. He asked how Merlin could be in this room. Merlin confessed that the one who placed magic protectors throughout the academy was him, and he could make as many as he wanted. Then, he asked them not to tell this to others because he would definitely be scolded by everyone. Hawk only stayed silent and observed him. He knew that it turned out Merlin had heard everything that happened in this room, and he praised his good personality. Merlin suddenly observed Hawk and said in his heart that he would take his words as praise. Hawk was surprised because it turned out Merlin could also read minds. Merlin explained that he didn't peek into students' memories and thoughts except on rare occasions. Moreover, he also considered it impolite. Hawk felt that even though Merlin didn't do it didn't mean he couldn't. Merlin confessed it was only because Hawk's expression was too clear. He said students' privacy should be protected. After that, Hawk was curious because Merlin could read his mind and memory. That meant he knew about Hawk's past life that he had avoided so much all this time. He was a strange person who reincarnated from another world with knowledge that never existed in this world. He wondered if they would let a terrifying little child alone. He could be found out, tortured, and forced to reveal everything he knew. Actually, Hawk felt being revealed as the author of the paper was still fine, then only asked Rosa to refuse the offer to skip classes, and everything ended. However, Merlin's arrival to take the risk. Hawk guessed the old man definitely had a plan. He was sure Merlin's silly plan definitely wouldn't work. When Hawk wanted to say something to him, Merlin asked them to calm down. He explained his arrival was not to punish them. After that, Merlin looked at Hawk. He asked if the child had no desire to take the girl's place and skip classes to enter the university. The offer made Hawk nervous because this was like his guess. Merlin's offer to take Rosa's place and skip classes to the university made the three of them tense. Hawk concluded based on Merlin's words, the people in the Scholars Guild were true eccentrics who didn't care whether it was nobles or commoners as long as they could discuss the paper in detail. He guessed his headmaster had also checked the paper and suggested class skipping. He guessed everything had been prepared very thoroughly. Hawk told Merlin that attributeless magic research was an action that could cause conflict with the crown and the church. He questioned whether it was really no problem for Merlin as headmaster to act on the path that supported it. Merlin answered that he himself was a magician and researcher. He regarded religious pressure that hindered magic studies as something he allowed. Hawk felt annoyed with that answer. Merlin also said this should not be a bad thing for them either. He explained that the high officials of the Scholars Guild were not religious or nobles. Merlin explained they were only a group of useless people who were only interested in research. He was also sure it was a comfortable place for people like Hawk, making the child nervous. Meanwhile, Rosa, who was silent, suddenly said something impolite, making Pickles immediately scold her not to say that as a lady. Pickles said he understood Rosa's feelings because he didn't expect the headmaster to be so straightforward. Meanwhile, Merlin explained the world was always full of surprises and unexpected things. He told her that Hawk's father also learned it when he became king. Then he offered if Hawk was willing. Hawk felt nervous, but he finally accepted the offer. After Hawk thought about it from the benefit side, it was not a bad deal. He was sure the Zero siblings might be happy to see more research on attributeless magic. If he could achieve any results from that research, he could also get a rank so he could decide his engagement with Sunny. Hawk didn't want to marry or have children because of his parents. He had been bearing the pressure to marry for the past 2 years, so if he didn't marry, he would complete 1 or 2 bachelor degrees. He also conveyed to his father about his decision to skip classes. His father, who heard it, felt proud because he exceeded his expectations. He boasted about Hawk, who surprised him. He even planned to hold a big party to celebrate Hawk's skipping classes and show it to everyone, including the nobles who always looked down on them. However, Hawk asked not to hold a party because he was worried if it spread too much, they would be viewed cynically by everyone. Hawk told his father that if he wanted to boast about his father should try to use this opportunity to gain benefit by acting humble on the surface as usual. He also suggested words to mock with Hawk successfully skipping classes while their children lost to a child from commoners. His father praised the naughty idea and praised Hawk as he had hoped. That night, the head of Magicians Guild, head of Merchants Guild, and head of Scholars Guild were gathered. Merlin was also there. Hawk's father introduced his son to them. He then placed a bag of coins, which he said might be a trivial amount. The old woman, who was the head of Merchants Guild, advised Eagle not to place money carelessly here. Meanwhile, the beast, who was the head of Scholars Guild, accepted it because of his policy not to refuse what was obtained without hesitation because the existing research funds were never enough. Then, the beast man directly asked Hawk for his opinion about attributeless magic. The man said the concept of attributeless magic was a taboo in this country, so there hadn't been much research on it. He felt the emergence of a genius child like Hawk would soon change this era. The man who became the head of Magicians Guild confirmed and praised the content of the paper written by Hawk was truly quite new from his point of view. He confessed there were many active discussions happening in the Magicians Guild. Merlin praised Hawk, who was very popular. Meanwhile, his father tapped the glass and expressed thanks to all of them for the special support to his son. He had also prepared a small gift for them from the gold company and begged them to accept it. Eagle asked the old woman if it was no problem. The old woman commented on Eagle, who always spent money on everything, and called it a bad habit to change the situation as he wanted. However, she still accepted it with an open heart. Meanwhile, Merlin apologized because he couldn't accept it. He reasoned there was a rule not to accept money from students' parents, which he said was quite unfortunate. Eagle said he would give more donations to the academy than usual, then thanked him for taking care of his son. Merlin felt that would be wonderful. While the head of Scholars Guild said they had gone through a lot of trouble to arrange for Hawk to skip several classes. He also promised to watch over Eagle's son. The head of Merchants Guild expressed she would probably be more worried if it was handed to the beast. Meanwhile, the head of Magicians Guild talked about Eagle and Hawk, who had come here to meet the three guilds. He considered the old woman's words too excessive, knowing that the cruel Eagle was only a parent who spoiled his son too much. While the head of Scholars Guild expressed obstacles that could be overcome with money should be overcome as much as possible. He also said the path to learning was also a path to fight people who didn't understand, and if they were negligent, they could be stuck at important points. The head of Magicians Guild criticized his overly theatrical way of speaking. Hawk, who observed their very strong personalities, felt like he would get a stomach ulcer. However, he felt it was worth bearing if it meant he could leave the stupid children at the academy. He would also interact less with Pickles and Rosa, so he would be free from life as a servant. Seeing that, Merlin commented on Hawk, who was truly a difficult child. Hawk felt annoyed and asked him not to speak directly into his head. Merlin said if the child's expression remained like that, it would be difficult for him to find friends at the university. Hawk stayed silent and was curious how the makeshift mental barrier magic held up against the greatest sage in the country. However, he felt it was better than doing nothing. He also knew he wouldn't be able to have friends at all. Hawk was a 10-year-old child who skipped classes with a paper about heresy, so it was impossible to be accepted. He was far more sure that what awaited him, there was more bullying. Hawk, who had turned 11 years old, now officially became a new student at the Royal University. He introduced himself to them and said that starting today, he would be in the same class as them. People seemed friendly and praised him, but when Hawk used his magic, he could read their thoughts that mocked him and doubted him. Hawk felt relieved because he had also guessed a reaction like that. When in class, suddenly Merlin came and asked if the child was enjoying his university life. Hawk was surprised because he should already know just by looking. He also said he was only trying to focus so as not to stand out. Merlin observed the people who were noisily sitting beside them. He never expected they couldn't penetrate this level of concealment magic. Making him feel the pride of the Royal University had been torn apart. Hawk commented on their vision that had been blinded by prejudice. So, it would be easier for him to disturb them. Merlin said academic studies began by observing various things from various points of view with an unbiased perspective because he wasn't interested in making assumptions only from subjective first impressions. Hawk questioned why Merlin didn't just say it directly to them if that was what he was thinking. He felt there were many things in this world that were hard to notice unless someone pointed them out. Hawk also knew in the end, people would think he was treated unfairly because of the headmaster. Merlin commented on Hawk's way of speaking that wasn't like a little child as usual. Hawk answered that he was indeed born like this. When sitting on a university park bench, suddenly someone disturbed Hawk's lunch. The person commented on Hawk eating his lunch alone again today, so he offered to join him. Hawk felt honored by that. His words made the young man laugh because he had told Hawk to act normal and just call him Rutabaga. He said in this academy there were no royal or noble families because everyone was equal. Rutabaga Branston, the second prince of the Branston kingdom, was Pickle's half-blood older brother. Rutabaga asked about Hawk's morning lesson. He also asked him to ask anything he didn't understand or question. Hawk confessed that he was more confused why Rutabaga gave attention to someone from low descent like him. Rutabaga sat beside Hawk. He explained that Hawk was a genius child with a reputation as the first to skip classes since his older brother, so everyone was curious about him. Rutabaga also expressed after all the difficulties they went through to get to know each other. He couldn't stand seeing Hawk alone all the time. Hawk thanked him for the attention. However, he begged Rutabaga to leave him alone. He said he didn't want to cause trouble for himself or the people around him again. Rutabaga understood. Then he told Hawk that it had become a hot topic in the royal palace, right when they thought Pickles finally had a friend who turned out to be an ordinary merchant. Rutabaga wanted Hawk to realize that he had already attracted more attention from people because he had written a paper about attributeless and skipped classes. Hawk thanked him for the praise, making Rutabaga pat his head and say that Hawk was truly a strange child. He expressed that was also the reason he was very curious about Hawk. After Rutabaga released him, Hawk stayed silent, annoyed at him. Then, Rutabaga gave him a tennis racket, offering to exercise after eating. Hawk stayed silent and wanted to refuse with the reason because he was still a child and because he had just finished eating. However, in the end he accepted the offer because an ordinary person couldn't refuse an offer from a prince. When about to start the game, Rutabaga asked Hawk's opinion about the current state of academics in this country. However, Hawk didn't think about it at all, making Rutabaga surprised. Hawk confirmed because he felt it would be rude for an ordinary person like him to think like someone like Rutabaga. The young man asked if Hawk's words were truly true, that they were the ones who made Hawk keep his mouth shut like that. When Rutabaga hit the ball, Hawk only dodged. He said that was only a joke. His reaction made Rutabaga smile. Then, Hawk questioned what Rosa, Pickles, and Rutabaga expected from someone like Hawk. Rutabaga asked if Hawk wasn't happy being used. Hawk denied it, because he only felt strange and was sure there were more useful tools than him. Rutabaga's royal and noble family had a way of life not to hesitate to use what was available. He explained that he and his siblings were born to become tools for someone. Rutabaga confessed maybe that was the reason he was interested in someone like Hawk, who was full of respect, but also free and never afraid of anyone he faced. Hawk asked if he really looked that arrogant. Rutabaga said that he liked it, and he was sure including those children too. When the bell rang, Rutabaga said their time was up and offered to go now. When Rutabaga went ahead, Hawk only stayed silent, left alone on the tennis court. In the Royal University Research Building, a middle-aged man asked if the true nature of attributeless wasn't only cancellation and initialization of information from the elements changed in the human body, but also the direction given to those elements. Hawk said it was only a theory, but he thought regardless of light or water attributes, Hawk knew that recovery magic had no effect on Van. He explained when touched, that magic disappeared. He explained the element given by the caster into a specific attribute became overwritten, so it made him have no attribute. Hawk said its recovery effect would definitely be the highest as attributeless recovery magic, which made it strange. Hawk questioned if the recovery spell was cancelled. Where did those elements go? They were all surprised by the explanation about attributeless recovery magic and had never thought about something like that. One of them even confessed he never knew what attributeless magic could do. Hawk then explained about the magic they usually used formed from elements in the atmosphere that passed through the human body and gave different attributes depending on the individual's body. He explained that process could be triggered by adding commands into it. Hawk's explanation immediately became discussion material for the scholars there. They started talking about attributeless magic that was completely no different in results until discussing wood-type recovery magic among the elves. As for the one talking about elements and magic attributes, and saying that this could turn the world upside down, another researcher felt this was a very dangerous way of thinking, but it made them excited to find out. They were excited because this destroyed people's common thinking and became the reason they couldn't stop researching at all, while others thought there was a possibility to separate the elements until causing a paradigm shift. Another scholar felt it was a unique point of view. Hawk argued the idea to convert attributeless elements might have been wrong from the start. He was sure because there was already evidence by overriding fire magic with ice magic, or hijacking wood magic with fire magic making magic increase. Hawk argued elements had no attributes from the start and were only added by humans afterward. That opinion received praise from the scholars because they had never thought that far, saying that it truly changed the perspective. They were excited to research, experiment, and verify it right now. The head of Scholars Guild praised Hawk's greatness. He felt inviting him here was the right choice. Then, he told all of them that now there was no time to relax. After that, Hawk was in his room feeling very exhausted. However, if he wanted to avoid the arranged marriage, he felt he might need to achieve more results. He also felt there was nothing wrong with helping the Zero siblings, because that was also the reason why he had no time to rest. When suddenly someone knocked on his room door, Hawk wondered who had come. When he stood up, suddenly he fell from his seat until it shocked him. Crescent, who knocked on the door, immediately opened his room door and asked if the child was okay. When Hawk woke up, he wondered if he was now in the hospital, while Crescent was relieved because he finally woke up. Hawk greeted Crescent because they hadn't met in a long time, while Crescent scolded him for greeting him and called him an idiot. Hawk felt idiot was a little cruel. However, Crescent told him to be quiet because he felt Hawk had been enough of an idiot. Hawk asked to make sure Crescent didn't contact his father because if Eagle knew his son fainted from doing too much research, Hawk wouldn't be allowed out of his room. The tiger said he didn't do it because he knew Hawk would say something like that, so he made sure Oliver didn't contact Eagle. He asked Hawk to be grateful for that. Hawk apologized because Crescent got trouble like that because of him. He said he would take a short break, then return to the university, so Crescent could spend his time freely without worrying about Hawk. However, Crescent prevented Hawk from leaving. Hawk only apologized to him. However, suddenly Crescent asked if they had done something to him. Hawk was confused because he didn't do anything to him because he had been protecting him. Crescent was annoyed and asked if Hawk didn't realize it at all, making him call him an idiot and hit his head. Crescent said he couldn't hold it anymore, explaining he was easier to get angry compared to those two. Meanwhile, Hawk wondered if he had done something. Crescent forced Hawk back to the bed. He said that Hawk didn't do anything because he suddenly stopped doing anything. He started bringing up the things they did together and did fun things like that. He complained about Hawk, who suddenly stopped caring about that. Crescent asked if there was something they could do for Hawk, asking him to say something if he wanted. He asked if Hawk had problems with them because he didn't understand why Hawk suddenly changed his behavior and became cold to them. Hawk thought about himself being cold, then remembered when Crescent was with Van. Meanwhile, Crescent said if he did something, he would apologize. He wanted Hawk to look at them again. Hawk told him that even if Crescent asked him to look at them, he would still do it. However, when he saw Crescent's face, he stayed silent, while Crescent apologized to him. When Oliver came back to the room, he was surprised and pointed a gun at Crescent. He asked what the tiger was doing. He accused Crescent of trying to strangle Hawk. However, Hawk said that he was fine. He greeted Oliver, making Oliver ask if something was wrong. The wolf asked if Hawk's head had been hit by a choice. He would also call a doctor if Hawk had any memory problems. Hawk said he was fine. However, suddenly he cried and Crescent wiped his tears. Hawk then asked if they liked him. Oliver admitted it. He asked if that was a problem. However, Hawk answered that it wasn't at all and felt it was fine. At Van's residence, Hawk informed him about the latest situation. He told him that after entering the university, he rarely contacted Rosa, so he apologized to Van for being late in giving his letter. Van felt it was no problem because he already felt happy enough that Hawk sent the letter to him. Van asked if something happened because Hawk looked fresher or had lost one of his burdens. Hawk said that something very good had happened. Meanwhile, someone was targeting Van's mother from behind the window and shot an arrow that surprised Van and Hawk. Crescent immediately raised his alertness, while Oliver asked the three of them to avoid the window. When Crescent found the person who shot the arrow, he immediately threw his sword and managed to prevent the woman from leaving. He even managed to knock her down, while Crescent immediately captured her and brought her before them. Hawk wondered what they would do. Crescent suggested killing her because he wasn't skilled in torture. He said he would destroy her directly. Meanwhile, Van wondered because his mother was being targeted. Hawk said in this condition, it must be because of a ducal family. Van guessed it must be his father. Then, Hawk said he would read that person's mind. Hawk was surprised because he found that an assassin's guild really existed. Van was also surprised when he heard it. Hawk explained it was a request to kill Van and his mother and dispose of their bodies. He guessed they hadn't been told the reason for targeting their lives. Van was annoyed and wondered why his father did this, while Hawk felt this was his fault. He knew that Rosa was secretly planning to return Van to the ducal family, and Pickles, who was her fiancé, was also helping her. He guessed the Duke might be anxious because of the big changes that happened when Hawk skipped classes with his paper about attributeless magic. Even though Hawk was the author, it was Rosa who replaced him for the presentation, which made research on attributeless magic develop quite rapidly until it spread to a level that could not be ignored. He imagined the Duke who had gotten rid of Van and questioned the meaning of all this. Then, he decided to report this to the 13 apostles of the goddess Faith. However, when reporting, those people felt there was no reason to punish the children because there was no evidence, making the Duke annoyed and take drastic action. Hawk felt it made sense, but he wasn't satisfied with that explanation. However, suddenly Hawk realized that meant something had happened. He immediately ordered Crescent to send Van and his mother to Rosa because that place was safer than here. Crescent wondered why Hawk was in a hurry because after that he ordered Oliver to return to the mansion with him. Oliver wondered why they were going to the Gold Mansion. Hawk shouted it was Laurier. He said that he saw a glimpse of her with people connected to the Assassin's Guild. He explained if the Duke was indeed affiliated, now was the right time to take action. Meanwhile, Laurier somewhere had already prepared with a dagger in her hand. At the Gold Mansion, Hawk asked Bazel about Laurier's whereabouts. Bazel said he hadn't seen the head maid wandering around at all, making Hawk know that they were already too late. Bazel asked what happened because of Hawk's expression like that. Hawk said that the Assassin's Guild had moved and targeted Van's and the others' lives. He asked him to protect his father and the others and watch over the assassin they had captured. Bazel obeyed his order. Then, Hawk asked if Oliver could detect her scent. Oliver answered he would try, then carried Hawk on his neck. When they met Crescent, who had returned from bringing Van and his mother to the Royal Academy. Crescent also reported a message from Rosa thanking him for saving their lives. Hawk thanked him for that. Then Oliver showed the direction to Hawk. The child immediately ordered him to hurry there. Upon arriving at Duke Zero's mansion, Hawk had already guessed what Laurier was doing. When they were there, they were intercepted by the assassins. Crescent asked Hawk to go while he would face those people. When Hawk was about to protest, Crescent immediately asked Oliver to give him his gun. The wolf refused, making Crescent surprised because they would definitely because of two people. Oliver answered that Crescent's two hands couldn't fit with the trigger guard. The tiger felt annoyed when he realized it. When Hawk was about to say something to Crescent, the tiger asked if the child wanted to ask him to be lenient on them. However, Hawk instead ordered him to move as wildly as he wanted. Crescent felt very happy, while Hawk left all this to him. An assassin asked his comrades to prevent them from leaving. However, Crescent surprised them and said they must not turn their faces away from him because he was serious right now. They planned to attack all four at once because Crescent was only a muscular Daruma. When they united to attack him, Crescent easily avoided them. He said they were slow, then attacked them without mercy. When an assassin trembled because of it, Crescent threatened him not to run away. Meanwhile, Oliver and Hawk entered the mansion. When he saw ice there, Hawk guessed it belonged to Laurier. When he heard an attack, Oliver quickly pulled Hawk and took cover behind the mansion's support pillar. Oliver saw there was a sniper. He estimated there were possibly 3 of them and felt this was a problem. When he noticed Hawk, who stayed silent, Oliver then showed his master that he could see the stairs behind the room. He said when he gave the signal, the child must run there. When Hawk hesitated, Oliver asked him not to worry because he would follow after this. After Hawk understood, Oliver gave the signal. The child immediately ran very fast. However, a sniper called him an idiot because he was very visible. When the sniper's arrow was about to hit him, an ice blocked the shot. The sniper was surprised because the ice was used as a mirror. The woman realized Oliver, who was aiming both pistols at the sniper, and shot him. The other snipers felt annoyed, while Oliver continued his attack. Meanwhile, Hawk ran until he reached a room and called Laurier, who was there. Laurier was not surprised when Hawk came there, while Duke Zero was surprised Hawk was there. He said if it wasn't because of the child, this horrible chaos shouldn't have happened. Hawk asked what the Duke meant. However, Laurier said the child didn't need to hear anything. The woman said that the Duke was investigated for the murder of his wife and child and cornered until he committed suicide. She said when the Duke's family was destroyed, everything would be fine again. Duke Zero asked Laurier to be quiet and called her a crazy woman who became a tool. However, Laurier asked the man to be quiet in return. She used her ice magic to close the man's mouth. While Hawk asked Laurier to talk, the woman said there was nothing to talk about. Hawk asked if the woman was sure because if Laurier killed the Duke and disappeared before the child arrived, everything would definitely end. But she didn't do that. Hawk guessed she must have her own reason for doing this. Laurier had difficulty answering him, while Hawk started realizing something. He felt there was no good thing coming from being depressed because of his wrong assumption and paranoia until pushing himself into a corner. He said if Laurier had something she wanted to convey, the woman should say it properly, because if not, what she wanted to convey wouldn't be conveyed to others. Hawk thanked the people who made him realize because they didn't leave him. That was the reason he wanted to talk with Laurier. He asked why Laurier did this and questioned the situation. He wanted to know what Laurier was thinking and feeling. The woman said that her master had become an extraordinary person and dropped her ice weapon. Hawk smiled because of that. Then he asked if Laurier could tell how this could happen. Laurier agreed. She also asked him to melt the ice around the Duke's mouth after this, and Laurier agreed to do it. While Crescent and Oliver waited for the two of them outside, a series of incidents that had occurred, and the mastermind behind all this was the queen of this country. She was a loyal follower of the goddess Faith and greatly loved her only son, the crown prince. She greatly avoided the sons of the other concubines. In particular, she had repeatedly tried to kill the second prince, Rutabaga, and the third prince, Pickles. Both were children of concubines who had inheritance rights. The queen didn't like the Zero ducal family, which was Pickles' fiancé's family. Duke Zero said if the situation continued like this, the reputation of the Zero ducal family would continue to worsen and promised, as a member of the faction that followed the first prince, he gave loyalty to her son the queen. Duke Zero panicked and begged her for support from the woman, but his plea was rejected. At this time, because her son Vanity was found to be attributeless. Moreover, there were rumors that possibly he had the power to use attributeless magic. Duke Zero regarded it as something embarrassing. However, the queen was not satisfied because the existence of attributeless was not recorded in the scriptures, and it was a taboo that could not be accepted by the goddess religion. The queen thought if Duke Zero truly promised loyalty to the first prince, he must prove it by getting rid of his son. Apparently, that was the order given by the queen to Duke Zero. After hearing Laurier's explanation, Hawk guessed Duke Zero threw his wife and child out to protect them from the evil queen's grasp. Duke Zero confirmed it. He confessed he pretended to be angry and expelled them from the name and status of the Zero ducal family. He thought if he made a big commotion by saying they would never be allowed to enter the ducal family again, the queen wouldn't kill them. Meanwhile, Hawk remembered he had accused the ducal family of doing this, making him feel guilty. While Duke Zero explained that Rosa's opposition became the perfect cover because the more his daughter criticized him, the fewer people around him thought he was protecting his wife and son. Hawk asked if that meant they ended up destroying that plan. Duke Zero confirmed because Hawk's involvement was not needed at all. Duke Zero explained when Hawk realized this. What Hawk could do was only ask Merlin, who was famous as a great sage, to protect Rosa. Then, the man guessed if their scenario was that he asked the Assassin's Guild to kill his wife and son, then committed suicide because he felt guilty, so the ducal family was destroyed. Hawk defended Laurier because in the end she betrayed the queen at the last moment. Laurier agreed. She explained as compensation for the total destruction of the ducal family. She begged that the lives of everyone in the Gold family be spared. She said the queen would consider it, depending on her performance. However, Laurier and Hawk knew that the evil queen would hold her mouth's promise. Laurier confirmed that she doubted killing the Duke was the right action. Then they met him. Hawk was surprised because Laurier asked for that at the beginning because he thought with certainty that the woman hated him and his father. Laurier explained it was true at first, at least until 3 years ago. However, she admitted everything started changing on the day when Hawk fell from the stairs. Hawk told Laurier that as long as she served his family as a maid, he would only order her to serve him as her master. Hawk also explained what he fired the extraordinary head maid for. However, he also allowed her to leave, but also permitted her to stay as long as she wanted. Laurier said for her, who had only been a tool for the organization and a killer for as long as she could remember, the days she spent with her master in the mansion were her most valuable treasure. Laurier almost felt as if she had become an ordinary person. However, Duke Zero confessed it was the end for all of them. He said because his murder failed and Hawk's maid betrayed him, the queen would definitely be very angry. He said soon both the Zero ducal family and the gold trading company would be eradicated. Laurier said if that was the problem, she would attack the queen even if it meant surrendering her own life. However, Hawk suggested to the two of them before the two of them died, why not try anything they could? He said right now the Duke could cooperate to do something to that problematic queen. However, Laurier felt this situation was very terrifying. She wondered what they could do. Hawk answered with the power of love, courage, friendship, and relationships, money, and connections, they would find it. After that, many things happened. Like the queen who was said to have accidentally fallen from the palace stairs and injured her head and made her fall into a coma. If there was no one around there who gave orders for evil deeds, the secret unit, under 3, wouldn't operate. Regarding the goddess Faith, it seemed the branch head Gametsu and the Duke had held a meeting regarding financial matters, making Van Kuen's handling go smoothly and pleasantly. Regarding research on attributeless magic and its users, even though it seemed to stop from the outside, the research continued secretly under the headmaster's protection. With the loss of the problematic queen, Van was allowed to return to the ducal family as Vanity Zero. The misunderstanding with his father had been resolved, and his mother returned to the dukedom. However, Van confessed that many things that happened weren't bad at all. So he continued his life as an ordinary person, Van. However, Rosa was very stubborn, but Van asked the girl to persuade her to give in. At this time, Rosa often visited Van, who lived alone on the outskirts of the city. Eagle was very impressed that through this incident, the Duke owed Hawk a lifetime debt, making his father's affection increase even more. Regarding this incident, Eagle said it was no problem if they targeted him, but targeting Hawk was something he could never forgive. Eagle was very angry when he said that. Hawk was sure the nobles from the First Prince's faction might have experienced extraordinary financial difficulties. Laurier still worked here as the head maid, while for Hawk himself, the Gold family and Zero ducal family went together to an onsen to celebrate their hard work. Hawk said he was very tired and soaked happily beside Crescent. Crescent thanked Hawk for his hard work. Meanwhile, Eagle had his back cleaned by Bazel, while Van was with Oliver under the waterfall. When Hawk observed the sky, Duke Zero asked if it was okay if he sat beside him. Hawk allowed it. Duke Zero felt very grateful to Hawk. He confessed he didn't know how to express his gratitude. Hawk felt it was no problem, because he also had to do something to the queen. Duke Zero thanked him for that, because his family survived, so he wanted to express his thanks by bowing to Hawk. Hawk felt embarrassed and accepted his thanks. After that, his father called Hawk to sit on his father's lap. Crescent teased Hawk, who was called by his father, while Hawk was surprised because his father was still gentle with him like before. Bazel asked Hawk not to say that and asked him to be good to his parents while he still could. Oliver also agreed. Hawk knew. Then he told his father he would come there now.